Close your eyes and let the noise fade. Slowly, the world you know disappears, voices, movement, the quiet hum of human life. What replaces it is something older, deeper, a silence that feels alive. You drift backward, far beyond memory, beyond history. The air is warmer here, heavier, untouched. Around you, towering ferns and ancient plants stretch toward an open, endless sky. There are no roads, no signs, just a world that has never known you. And then, you feel it. A low vibration in the ground, slow, powerful. Something is moving. In the distance, trees begin to part, not violently, but with purpose. Whatever is there is massive and completely at home. You don't feel fear, only awe, because in this moment you understand this world doesn't need humans. It never did. We're going somewhere vast tonight, somewhere that most people have never truly imagined, because the numbers involved are so large that the mind tends to slide off them rather than grasp them fully. We are going to the Mesozoic era, that great sprawling chapter of Earth's story that lasted more than 180 million years. The age of dinosaurs, yes, but more than that, much more than that. Because here is what most people don't realize. When we say the age of dinosaurs, we are compressing something enormous into a phrase so small it barely does the job. 180 million years. That is not a story with a beginning and an end. That is a library, hundreds of thousands of volumes deep, and we have only ever read a handful of pages. Most of the chapters remain sealed. Most of the voices remain silent. Most of what happened in those 180 million years is still, even now, a mystery. Tonight, we are going to sit with that mystery. We are going to walk through the parts of the dinosaur era that scientists still cannot fully explain. The creatures that should not have existed the way they did. The events that unfolded in ways no one predicted. The ecosystems so strange, so alien, so far outside anything in our modern experience that even the experts who study them professionally sometimes pause and admit, quietly, that they are not entirely sure what they are looking at. This is not a story about what we know. This is a story about the edges, the beautiful, humbling, quietly astonishing edges of our knowledge, where the fossils grow sparse and the questions multiply and the ancient world whispers something we cannot quite make out. Let your breathing slow. Let each exhale carry a little more tension away. The night is soft around you, and the story ahead is long and gentle and full of wonder. We are going to the Mesozoic, and we are going to discover just how much of it we still do not understand. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before there were dinosaurs, there was a world so alien, so hostile, so fundamentally different from anything we have ever experienced, that to stand in it would have felt like landing on another planet entirely. Picture this. 252 million years ago, something went catastrophically wrong. Volcanoes in what is now Siberia began erupting on a scale so immense, so sustained, so geologically extraordinary that the resulting devastation reshaped every ocean, every continent, every food chain on the face of the Earth. The eruptions continued for perhaps 2 million years. The gases they poured into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, drove temperatures so high that the equatorial regions of the planet became, in effect, dead zones, places where nothing larger than a bacterium could survive. By the time the eruptions finally slowed, somewhere between 90 and 96% of all species on Earth had gone extinct. Every coral reef, nearly every fish in the sea, the vast majority of land animals, gone. The event is called the Permian-Triassic extinction, and it is not merely the worst mass extinction in Earth's history. It is the closest our planet has ever come to losing complex life entirely. And into the silence that followed, that vast, echoing, geological silence, something new had to rise. This is where the Triassic period begins, 252 million years ago, give or take. And this is where our first great mystery presents itself. Because the recovery from the Permian extinction was not straightforward. It was not a simple story of life bouncing back, filling the empty niches, rebuilding what had been lost. The early Triassic was strange in ways that still puzzle researchers today. For approximately 5 million years after the extinction, 5 million years, which is longer than our entire genus Homo has existed, ecosystems around the world showed almost no recovery at all. The oceans remained chemically chaotic. The land remained largely barren. The few species that survived seemed to exist in a kind of ecological limbo, neither truly flourishing nor dying out completely. Geologists call this the early Triassic recovery gap, and its length is difficult to explain. Why would recovery take so long? After previous mass extinctions, and there had been several before the Permian catastrophe, life had rebounded within 1 million years or so. Fast, in geological terms. Explosive, even. Empty niches fill quickly when evolution has room to run. But after the Permian extinction, something held life back. Something kept the clock from running. The leading hypothesis involves the persistence of lethal ocean conditions. The same volcanic activity that triggered the extinction continued pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for millions of years after the worst of the dying had stopped. The oceans, having absorbed enormous quantities of this gas, became acidic in ways that made shell formation nearly impossible. Temperature gradients in the water column were disrupted, preventing the circulation that normally brings oxygen-rich water to deep-sea environments. Large swaths of the ocean floor became anoxic, oxygen depleted, and remained that way for an extraordinarily long time. On land, the situation was different but equally strange. The forests that had existed before the extinction were gone. The soils that had supported them were eroded, leached of nutrients, stripped of the fungal networks that help plants absorb what they need. Early Triassic landscapes, as preserved in the fossil record, show a world dominated by ferns and simple conifers, the botanical equivalent of a blank canvas, with very little complexity or layering. The animals that did survive were for the most part small, reptiles, a few early relatives of mammals called cynodonts, moving cautiously through a world that had almost killed everything. And here is something remarkable. Most of these early Triassic survivors belonged to just a handful of genera. The world had been reset to something very close to zero, and the slate of life was nearly blank. This is important to understand because it sets the stage for everything that follows. When dinosaurs eventually emerged, and they would not emerge for another 15 or 20 million years after the Permian extinction, they were not arriving into a world already full and complicated. They were arriving into a world still in the process of being rebuilt, a world where the ecological rulebook was still being written. But before we can talk about dinosaurs themselves, we need to talk about the creatures that came before them, the ones that ruled the Triassic before the dinosaurs were ready, because here too there are mysteries that linger. The dominant land animals of the Middle Triassic were not dinosaurs. They were a group called the archosaurs, a broad category that included the ancestors of both dinosaurs and crocodilians, and within that category there were two main branches competing for dominance. One branch would eventually give rise to the dinosaurs and birds, the other would give rise to the crocodiles. In the Middle Triassic, before the ecological chaos of the later period reshuffled the deck, it was the crocodilian branch that seemed to be winning. The Rauisuchians, large quadrupedal predators with skulls full of blade-like teeth, were the apex predators of their era. Some of them were enormous, approaching 5 or 6 meters in length, with pillar-erect limbs that elevated their bodies off the ground in a way that allowed for a surprisingly efficient gait. They were not slow or clumsy. They were, in many respects, the top predators of their world, and by all ecological logic they should have remained so for millions of years to come, and yet they did not. They vanished at the end of the Triassic, wiped out by an extinction event that also claimed the etosaurs, the phytosaurs, and a host of other archosaur groups that had seemed so well established. And in their place, the dinosaurs rose. Why? This is one of the questions that paleontologists still wrestle with. The End-Triassic extinction, which occurred roughly 201 million years ago, was itself a significant event. Another pulse of massive volcanic activity, this time from the Central Atlantic magmatic province, which again flooded the atmosphere with greenhouse gases and disrupted global ecosystems. But the selectivity of the extinction is puzzling. Why did Rauisuchians die and theropod dinosaurs survive? Why did etosaurs vanish while early sauropodomorphs persisted? One hypothesis involves metabolic differences. Dinosaurs, it now appears, were likely warm-blooded, or at least far more metabolically active than the classic cold-blooded reptile model would suggest. Evidence from bone growth rings, from isotope studies of fossilized bone tissue, From the discovery of insulating feathers on many lineages, all points in the same direction. Dinosaurs had high metabolisms. They burned energy fast and they generated their own body heat, at least to some degree. If this is correct, then during the volcanic winter that followed the end Triassic eruptions, when sunlight was reduced, temperatures dropped, and food became scarce. The metabolic differences between dinosaurs and their competitors may have been decisive. Cold-blooded animals can slow their metabolisms dramatically during lean times, surviving on very little food. But they also struggle to remain active and competitive when temperatures fall below certain thresholds. Warm-blooded animals need more food overall, but they remain functional across a wider range of conditions. The exact interplay of these factors is still being debated. The fossil record from this critical transition period is frustratingly incomplete in many regions of the world. We see the before, a diverse Triassic ecosystem dominated by non-dinosaurian archosaurs, and we see the after, a world where dinosaurs have taken over. The transition itself, the precise mechanism, the exact sequence of events, remains partially obscured. This is the first great mystery of the dinosaur era. Not that dinosaurs existed, but how they came to dominate so thoroughly, so quickly, in a world that seemed to belong to other creatures entirely. The answer, buried in rock layers around the world, is still being excavated, still being pieced together, and it is not, even now, fully understood. But the Triassic has more mysteries to offer, because alongside the question of how dinosaurs rose, there is a quieter, stranger question that has only recently begun to attract serious scientific attention. A question about the world those early dinosaurs actually lived in. A question about what Earth's surface looked like, and felt like, and smelled like during those first tens of millions of years of the dinosaur age. The Triassic world was, in a word, extreme. Pangaea, the supercontinent that had been assembling itself for hundreds of millions of years, was beginning to break apart during this period, but it was still largely intact. A single landmass stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a vast global ocean. And the climate that resulted from this geography was unlike anything Earth has experienced since. The interior of Pangaea was a desert so vast, so dry, so brutally hot during the day and cold during the night, that it makes the modern Sahara seem like a mild inconvenience. Air masses flowing inland from the ocean lost their moisture within a few hundred kilometers of the coast. Beyond that threshold, almost nothing grew, almost nothing moved. The coastal regions, by contrast, experienced monsoons of staggering intensity, seasonal deluges so massive that they reshaped landscapes within days, rivers that grew from nothing to raging torrents in the space of an afternoon, and then for months at a time nothing, droughts so severe that riverbeds cracked and plants shriveled. Early dinosaurs evolved in this world of extremes. The very first dinosaurian lineages appear in the fossil record in Argentina and Brazil, in rock formations that preserve evidence of a seasonally arid environment, a world of wet seasons and dry seasons, of abundance and scarcity alternating in rhythms that shaped behavior and physiology in ways we are only beginning to understand. And here is something that still puzzles researchers. The first dinosaurs were not, by any obvious measure, particularly special. They were small, bipedal, and by the standards of their time, quite unremarkable. They shared their world with animals that seemed far more impressive, larger, more heavily armoured, presumably more powerful, and yet something about those early dinosaurs, some combination of traits or circumstances or luck, positioned them to inherit the Earth, while their more imposing neighbours perished. The mystery of dinosaur origins is, in this sense, the mystery of beginnings. Why do some lineages succeed when others, equally capable, do not? Why does the future belong to certain small, unprepossessing animals, lurking at the margins of an ecosystem dominated by their betters? The Triassic does not give us easy answers. It gives us fossils, fragmentary, partial, sometimes maddening in their incompleteness. And it leaves us to wonder. Let that wondering settle gently over you now. Let it be soft rather than sharp. There is something deeply calming about genuine mystery, about questions so large that they dissolve the ordinary anxieties of the day by sheer contrast. Whatever kept you busy today, whatever worried you, whatever felt urgent, none of it reaches this far back. None of it matters against the backdrop of 250 million years of life, finding its way through impossible circumstances. The early dinosaurs survived what should have killed them. They outlasted their betters. They inherited a world that had been swept nearly clean. And what they built from that inheritance would last, would genuinely last, for 165 million years. That is longer than the human mind can truly hold. But we can try. We can let the numbers wash over us like something ancient and enormous and in their own way profoundly restful. The Earth is very old, life is very patient, and tonight, in the quiet, we have all the time we need. If the Triassic is a mystery wrapped in extremes, the Middle Jurassic is something even stranger, a mystery wrapped in near silence. Here is the problem. We have a remarkably detailed understanding of the early Jurassic, the period from roughly 201 million to 175 million years ago, because the rocks from that era are preserved in numerous locations around the world, and the fossils they contain are relatively abundant. Similarly, we have an extraordinarily detailed understanding of the late Jurassic, that magnificent, bountiful period from approximately 160 to 145 million years ago, represented by formations like the Morrison Formation in the American West, the Tendaguru beds in Tanzania, the Zonhofen limestone in Germany. These are treasure troves of paleontological information, and from them we have reconstructed ecosystems of astonishing richness and complexity. But the Middle Jurassic, the period from roughly 175 to 160 million years ago, is, by comparison, almost blank. Not completely blank. There are important fossil sites from this period. The Stonesfield Slate in England, the Shishugo Formation in China, a handful of sites in Africa, in South America, in India. From these, we have gathered fragmentary but invaluable information about creatures that lived during this critical interval. But the overall picture is thin, patchy, and deeply frustrating to paleontologists who know they are looking at one of the most consequential chapters in the history of life on land. Because here is what makes the Middle Jurassic so important. It is during this period that dinosaurs, already diverse and widespread by the early Jurassic, underwent an evolutionary transformation so profound, so far-reaching in its consequences, that it set the template for everything that followed. It is during the Middle Jurassic that the great lineages of the later era, the giant sauropods, the advanced theropods, the ornithischians, that would eventually give rise to the horned and armoured and duck-billed dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, diverged, diversified, and began their radiation toward the forms we know and recognise. In other words, the Middle Jurassic is the chapter where the dinosaur story really took shape, and we can barely read it. Why is the record so sparse? Partly it is a simple matter of geology and geography. Rock preservation is uneven, sedimentary layers, from some time periods happen to be exposed at the surface today, accessible to paleontologists, while layers from other periods are buried deep underground, or have been eroded away entirely, or were never deposited in the first place in the regions where we have the infrastructure to dig. The Middle Jurassic simply had the misfortune of not leaving thick, accessible sedimentary sequences in as many places as the periods that bookend it. But partly, the scarcity reflects something more interesting. The Middle Jurassic world itself seems to have been, in many regions, a world of high ground, upland environments, drier habitats. And these are the environments least likely to preserve fossils in the first place, because fossilization requires rapid burial in sediment. The kind of burial that happens in floodplains, river deltas, lake beds. High, dry uplands tend to erode rather than deposit, and so the animals that lived in them vanish from the record without a trace. What we do know from the Middle Jurassic is both tantalizing and incomplete. We know that sauropods, those long-necked, long-tailed, enormous herbivores that would eventually include the largest land animals to ever walk the earth, were already present and diversifying. Early members of the lineage that would produce Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus and Argentinosaurus were moving through Middle Jurassic landscapes, growing large, developing the architectural innovations in their spines and limbs that would allow later members of the group to achieve body sizes that seem, even now, almost physically implausible. We know that theropods, the bipedal carnivores that included the ancestors of Tyrannosaurus rex, Velociraptor, and ultimately birds, were also diversifying, filling predatory niches at multiple size scales, developing the speed and agility and sensory sophistication that would eventually produce some of the most effective predators in the history of terrestrial life. And we know that the feathers which would eventually define birds were already present in some lineages during this period, perhaps much earlier than previously thought. Recent fossil discoveries have pushed the origin of feathers, or feather-like integumentary structures, deeper and deeper into dinosaur history. The question of exactly when feathers first appeared, and in which lineage, and what function they originally served, is one that Middle Jurassic fossils are uniquely positioned to answer, if only we had more of them. But here is the mystery that lies at the heart of the Middle Jurassic gap, and it goes beyond mere incompleteness of the fossil record. It is the mystery of emergence, of how complex biological innovations arise in the first place. Sauropods, during the Middle Jurassic, were getting large, very quickly in evolutionary terms. Within a few tens of millions of years, the lineage went from animals perhaps the size of large horses to creatures weighing 50, 60, even 80 tons or more. This transition is one of the most dramatic size increases in the history of vertebrate evolution, and the skeletal and physiological changes it required were immense. Think about what it means to be an 80-ton animal. Every system in your body needs to be reconfigured from the blueprint of something much smaller. Your bones cannot simply scale up linearly. They would collapse under their own weight. Your cardiovascular system needs to pump blood to a head that might be 12 or 15 meters above the level of your heart. Your digestive system needs to process, continuously, enormous quantities of low-nutrient plant matter, the equivalent of several trees every single day, just to fuel that immense body. Your respiratory system needs to operate efficiently enough to sustain an active animal with a metabolic demand that would seem, by any ordinary measure, impossible to meet. And yet sauropods did all of this. They solved every single one of these engineering problems, and they did it so effectively that the lineage persisted for more than 130 million years, producing some of the most successful large herbivores in the history of life. How? The skeletal evidence gives us some clues. Sauropod vertebrae are hollowed, riddled with air spaces like the bones of modern birds, drastically reducing weight without sacrificing structural strength. Sauropod respiratory systems, reconstructed from comparisons with modern archosaurs, almost certainly involve the kind of air sac breathing that birds use today, a system dramatically more efficient than the lung mechanics of mammals, capable of extracting far more oxygen per breath. These innovations made the giant size possible, at least in principle, but the details of how this system evolved step by step through the Middle Jurassic and into the Late remain partially obscure. The transitional forms, the animals that were, in a sense, in the process of becoming giants, are underrepresented in the fossil record. We see the before and we see the after. The during is still being pieced together, and it is not just sauropods. The Middle Jurassic was a period of extraordinary innovation across the entire archosaur family tree. Crocodile relatives were experimenting with terrestrial, even potentially arboreal lifestyles. Pterosaurs, those flying reptiles that shared the skies with nothing else vertebrate at the time, were diversifying into forms of extraordinary variety, some with wingspans of only a few centimeters, others already approaching the size of modern seagulls, and a few beginning the evolutionary experiments that would eventually produce animals with wingspans exceeding 10 meters. Marine reptiles were radiating through the world's oceans, filling every available niche from coastal shallows to open ocean depths. It was, in the truest sense, an age of exploration and experiment, life trying on new forms as rapidly as the rules of genetics and natural selection allowed, and the record of that exploration, thin and patchy as it is, gives us just enough to know what we are missing. There is something poignant about this. The Middle Jurassic was a world full of life, full of change, full of the kind of evolutionary drama that makes this chapter of Earth's history endlessly fascinating. Animals were finding new ways to exist. New ecologies were assembling themselves. The future of life on land was being sketched out in broad strokes by creatures whose names we barely know and whose appearances we can barely reconstruct, and almost none of it was preserved for us to find. Almost none of it left a clear enough trace in the rock that we can read it with any confidence. The Middle Jurassic is a chapter that the Earth wrote and then, for the most part, erased, and we are left with fragments, beautiful, tantalizing, insufficient fragments, and the humbling knowledge that we are looking at a story we will probably never fully understand. Let that sit with you gently. Let the incompleteness be something restful rather than frustrating. The world is older and richer than any record can capture. Life was happening before anyone was watching, before anyone was taking notes, before the sediment happened to be in the right place at the right time to press a footprint or a bone into stone and preserve it for 200 million years until someone came along with a brush and a magnifying glass and a very great deal of patience. What we have found is a gift. What remains hidden is an invitation, a reminder that the story is larger than we know, that the world in its deep past was full of wonders that have not yet been discovered, and perhaps never will be. That is not a sad thought as you let it settle over you now. It is simply vast, simply enormous, and enormous quiet things have a way of making the mind grow still. Let us stay for a while with the giants, because, among all the mysteries of the dinosaur era, the mystery of sauropod size may be the one that most stubbornly resists explanation. Not because we lack ideas, on the contrary, there are many, but because the sheer scale of what we are trying to explain is so far outside ordinary biological experience that our theories, however elegant, always seem slightly inadequate to the task. A blue whale can reach 30 meters in length and weigh nearly 200 tons. It is the largest animal that has ever existed. Period. Full stop. This record is secure. But the blue whale achieves this size in the ocean, where water supports the weight of the body and the animal never has to hold itself up against gravity. On land, the constraints are fundamentally different. On land, every gram of body mass has to be supported by a skeleton and driven by muscles, and the engineering required scales in non-linear ways that create strict biological limits. And yet Patagotitan majorum, a sauropod, discovered in Argentina and described in detail just a few years ago, almost certainly exceeded 69 tons, possibly more. It stood perhaps 6 meters at the shoulder and stretched nearly 37 meters from nose to tail. It is the largest land animal for which we have solid skeletal evidence, and it was not unique. Argentinosaurus, Supersaurus, Alamosaurus, and several other sauropods from different continents and time periods achieved comparable or potentially greater sizes. These were not exceptional individuals. They were representatives of lineages in which extreme gigantism was a recurring, successful, apparently stable life strategy. How? The question has been asked many times, and the answers that have been proposed are all in their way partial. Let us walk through them slowly, as the night deepens around you. The first piece of the puzzle is the respiratory system. Modern birds use a system of air sacs, essentially extensions of the lung that penetrate into the bones and hollow them out, that allows for a continuous one-way flow of air through the respiratory system. Unlike mammals, which breathe in and out through the same airways in a tidal pattern that limits efficiency, birds extract oxygen from fresh air on both the inhalation and the exhalation cycle. The result is a respiratory system roughly twice as efficient as that of a mammal of comparable size. Sauropods, as archosaurs closely related to birds, almost certainly use this system or something very similar. The evidence is written in their bones, literally. Sauropod vertebrae are pneumatized, riddled with air-filled chambers connected to the respiratory system, reducing the density of the skeleton dramatically without sacrificing structural strength. The result was a skeleton that weighed far less, as a proportion of total body mass, than the skeleton of a mammal of comparable dimensions would. This matters enormously. A 50-ton animal with a mammalian skeleton would be carrying so much bone that its muscles could barely move it. A 50-ton sauropod with a pneumatized skeleton that had shed perhaps 30% of the weight a comparable mammal would carry in bone was a fundamentally different engineering proposition. Less weight to move, more oxygen to fuel the movement, a viable, if remarkable, biological system. But the respiratory system alone doesn't explain everything. There is still the question of energy intake. How do you feed an animal that large? The mathematics are at first glance daunting. An elephant, a 4-ton herbivore, eats roughly 150 kilograms of vegetation per day and devotes enormous amounts of its daily time to feeding. Scale that up to 60 or 70 tons, even accounting for metabolic efficiencies, and you arrive at daily food requirements that seem almost impossible to satisfy. And yet sauropods were not spending most of their day chewing. We know this because sauropod skulls, however varied in shape, consistently show relatively simple teeth, peg-like or spoon-shaped tools for stripping vegetation from branches, and very little evidence of the complex grinding dentition that a mammalian megaherbivore uses to break down tough plant material before swallowing it. Sauropods were not chewing their food in the way that mammals do. They were swallowing it more or less whole, or with minimal processing, and relying on their digestive systems, presumably assisted by gastroliths, the stomach stones that many herbivorous archosaurs swallowed deliberately to help grind food in the gut, to do the work of breakdown internally. This strategy, which seems counterintuitive for an animal that needs to extract maximum nutrition from its food, is actually quite efficient in a different way. Chewing is metabolically expensive and time-consuming. By skipping the chewing step, sauropods freed up the time and energy of their head and neck for the single task they were extraordinarily well designed for: reaching food. That long neck, sometimes 12 or 15 meters from shoulder to snout, was a harvesting tool of genius. A sauropod standing in one place could sweep that neck through an arc covering hundreds of square meters of vegetation without moving its feet. It could reach the tops of trees that no other herbivore could touch. It could access resources that were simply unavailable to every other animal in its ecosystem. This is a compelling story, and it is well supported by the evidence. But it still doesn't fully explain the maximum size achieved. There are theoretical upper limits to sauropod body size, constraints imposed by bone strength, by cardiovascular demands, by the sheer logistics of circulating blood through an animal so enormous and so vertically extended, and those limits should, by some calculations, have prevented animals from exceeding perhaps 30 or 40 tons. Yet we have fossils of animals that exceeded that ceiling by a significant margin. The honest answer, offered carefully by researchers who have spent careers studying this question, is that we do not entirely know how they did it. The combination of factors, the efficient respiratory system, the low-cost food processing, the neck architecture, the pneumatized skeleton, possibly aspects of their social behavior and reproduction that we cannot directly observe, produced an animal that exceeded what our models would predict. And models, however sophisticated, are only as good as the assumptions built into them. There is something wonderfully humbling about this. We are living in an era of extraordinary scientific capability. We can analyze the chemical composition of bones laid down 200 million years ago. We can reconstruct the three-dimensional geometry of long-extinct animals with remarkable precision. We can model the fluid dynamics of ancient respiratory systems and the structural mechanics of ancient skeletons. And yet the largest land animals that ever lived remain in important ways beyond our full understanding. They existed. They are real. The bones are in museums on every continent, enormous and undeniable. But precisely how they achieved and sustained what they achieved and sustained, that remains a question with no single, satisfying, complete answer. And there are further mysteries nested within the main one. The sauropod neck, for instance, is not merely long. It is long in ways that should not, by the physics of the situation, be mechanically viable. The longest sauropod necks were held up by systems of tendons and muscles and air sacs that no living animal remotely resembles, operating on principles that biomechanics researchers are still in the process of working out. Computer models of the neck mechanics produce results that sometimes surprise even their creators, suggesting that the sauropods were doing things with their necks that our intuition would not have predicted. Were they holding their necks horizontally most of the time, like a living crane, sweeping broad areas of ground-level vegetation? Or were they rearing upright, the way a giraffe does, to reach into the canopy of the tallest Jurassic trees? The answer matters for understanding their ecology and their behavior, and the answer, based on the available evidence, is genuinely unclear. Different researchers, looking at the same fossils and using comparable methods, have reached different conclusions. The debate continues. Then there is the question of sauropod reproduction, which may be the strangest piece of the puzzle of all. We know, from fossilized eggs attributed to sauropod lineages, that these animals laid eggs. Not particularly large eggs, roughly the size of a volleyball in most cases, and laid in large clutches in shallow nests. The eggs were abandoned after laying, or at most lightly tended. There is no good evidence that sauropods provided the kind of prolonged parental care that birds do. This means that a newborn sauropod was extraordinarily small relative to its adult size. A hatchling that would grow to 60 tons as an adult weighed only about 5 kilograms when it emerged from the egg. In the intervening years, the decades it would take to reach adult size, That animal would pass through size classes occupied by enormous ranges of other animals, going from prey suitable for a medium-sized theropod to a target for only the very largest predators, and eventually to an adult size where it had, effectively, no natural enemies at all. How did so many individuals survive long enough to reach that protected adult size? The mortality rates must have been staggering, and the growth rates required to pass through the vulnerable intermediate stages as quickly as possible must have been extraordinary, among the fastest sustained growth rates ever recorded in a vertebrate animal, based on the bone histology evidence we have. Sauropods were in this sense biological wonders stacked on biological wonders. Every aspect of their life history seems to be operating at or beyond the theoretical limits of what is possible, and yet they were the dominant large herbivores of the Jurassic world for tens of millions of years. They were phenomenally successful. Whatever they were doing, it worked. The mystery of the sauropods is not really a mystery of failure or of inexplicability. It is a mystery of excess, of life operating at scales so far beyond ordinary that our frameworks for understanding it strain at their seams. These animals were real, and they were spectacular, and the full story of how they lived is still being told. In the dark of a Jurassic night, 200 million years before our own, a herd of these animals might have been moving through a forest of cycads and Araucarian conifers, their footsteps shaking the ground with a rhythm as slow and deep as a heartbeat. The young ones, still far from full size, staying close to the larger adults. The largest animals in the group, the old ones, the ones who had survived the dangerous decades of growth and arrived at a size that nothing could challenge, moving with a kind of geological inevitability, slow, enormous, unconcerned. Can you picture them? Can you feel, in some remote corner of the imagination, the ground trembling gently under those feet? The deep, low sound of that breathing, like wind moving through a very large space. Let that image settle over you now, warm and slow and ancient. The giants of the Jurassic night, moving through their world with perfect confidence, having solved in their own inscrutable biological way every problem that their impossible size created, present, real, and now very, very far away in time. Of all the unsolved questions in dinosaur paleontology, perhaps none is more actively and productively debated than the origin of birds. It is a question that has generated more scientific papers, more public interest, more genuine controversy, and more spectacular fossil discoveries in the past 30 years than almost any other question in the life sciences. And here is the strange thing about it. We know, with near certainty, that birds are dinosaurs. Not descended from dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs, but actually, biologically, technically, dinosaurs. Members of the theropod lineage, specifically the Maniraptorans, closely nested within the Coelurosaurian radiation that also includes animals like Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus. The evidence for this is overwhelming and cross-validated from multiple independent lines of inquiry: skeletal anatomy, soft tissue structure, molecular biology, behavioral ecology, developmental biology. Birds are, as the paleontologist Jack Horner has famously put it, non-avian dinosaurs that survived. So the fact of the relationship is settled. What is not settled, what remains the subject of vigorous, productive, genuinely fascinating scientific debate, is the question of how exactly birds evolved. Which lineage? Which features? In what sequence did the defining traits of birds appear? And above all, when and why did flight evolve? Let us begin with feathers, because feathers are the thing that most visibly connects modern birds to their dinosaurian ancestors, and because the story of feather evolution is stranger and richer than most people realize. Until the 1990s, feathers were considered a uniquely avian feature, a defining characteristic of birds that set them apart from all other animals, past and present. Then the Chinese fossil beds began to yield their extraordinary secrets. The Ixian and Jiufotang formations of Liaoning province in northeastern China were deposited roughly 125 to 130 million years ago during the early Cretaceous. They preserve in extraordinary detail animals that were buried rapidly in volcanic ash or lake sediments, conditions that allow soft tissues, including feathers and feather-like structures, to leave impressions in rock that would normally preserve only bone. The result is a paleontological treasure of unparalleled importance. From Liaoning, we have recovered feathered dinosaurs of multiple species across multiple lineages. Some of these were unambiguously early birds, closely related to Archaeopteryx, but others were clearly non-avian dinosaurs, animals that had no particular affinity with birds, that were not on the direct lineage leading to modern birds, that were simply dinosaurs, and yet wore feathers nonetheless. Sinosauropteryx, described in 1996, was the first clearly non-avian dinosaur shown to have feather-like integument. It was a compsognathid, a small-bodied coelurosaur about the size of a domestic cat, with a coat of simple filamentous structures running along its back and tail. Not the complex asymmetrical feathers of flying birds, simple fibres, protofeathers perhaps, but unmistakably feather-like in their microscopic structure. Since then, the list of feathered non-avian dinosaurs has grown remarkably. Microraptor had elaborate flight feathers on all four of its limbs, creating a four-winged gliding or flying animal whose aerodynamics still produce lively debate. Anchiornis was covered in complex pennaceous feathers from head to tail. Yichi had wing membranes rather than feathered wings, suggesting that the evolution of dinosaur in flight was not a single linear story, but a biological experiment tried in multiple ways by multiple lineages simultaneously. Perhaps most startling of all is the evidence, accumulating gradually from multiple fossil sites around the world, that feather-like integument may have been present very early in dinosaur evolution, possibly even at the base of the theropod radiation, or perhaps even at the base of the entire dinosaur family tree. Small patches of preserved integument from ornithischian dinosaurs, the branch, that includes Triceratops, Stegosaurus and Edmontosaurus, none of which are closely related to birds, show structures that look remarkably like simplified feathers. If this evidence holds up under continued scrutiny, it would mean that feathers, or their precursors, were a general dinosaurian feature from very early in the group's history. This transforms the question entirely. If feathers are a general feature of dinosaurs, then the question is not, how did birds evolve feathers? The question becomes, why did most dinosaurian lineages lose or reduce their feathers over time? And that is a profoundly different question, one that points toward different answers in different research directions. What did those early feathers do in animals that were not flying and perhaps had no near-term evolutionary trajectory toward flight? The best current hypothesis is thermoregulation, insulation. Feathers are extraordinarily good at trapping air close to the body, reducing heat loss, allowing an animal with an elevated metabolism to maintain its body temperature at lower environmental cost. If early dinosaurs were indeed metabolically active, warm-blooded in the broad sense, then feathers would have been useful from the very beginning, long before any lineage was experimenting with flight. Display is another strong possibility. Many modern birds use their plumage primarily for social communication, signaling fitness, species identity, and breeding readiness to potential mates and rivals. The complex colour patterns reconstructed in some Cretaceous feathered dinosaurs from Liaoning suggest that display was an important function very early in feather evolution. Anchiornis, whose melanosomes, the cellular structures responsible for colour in feathers, have been mapped with remarkable precision, appears to have been black and white with patches of rust red around the face, a striking pattern that suggests strong selective pressure for visual conspicuousness. So feathers evolved for insulation, or display, or both. They were then, in certain lineages, co-opted for a new function, aerodynamic surfaces. The transition from insulating fuzz to load-bearing flight feather required a series of developmental and structural innovations, changes in the way feathers branch and interlock, changes in the growth patterns of the forelimb that produced the elongated arm bones necessary for a functional wing. These changes happened gradually, over millions of years, in ways that we can trace, partially, through the fossil record. But even here, the mystery is not fully resolved. There are two broad hypotheses about how powered flight evolved in the theropod lineage. The first, the trees-down hypothesis, proposes that the ancestors of birds were arboreal, tree-climbing animals that used feathered forelimbs initially for gliding, and then gradually developed the muscular and skeletal modifications for powered, flapping flight. This is the sequence followed by some gliding animals today, and it has a certain physical logic. Gliding is energetically free, and improving a glide into a powered flight is, in some ways, a smaller evolutionary step than developing powered flight from the ground up. The second hypothesis, ground up, proposes that the ancestors of birds were ground-dwelling runners who used feathered forelimbs first for stability and then as lift-generating surfaces during high-speed running or leaping. Some evidence supports this view. The leg morphology of the earliest known birds suggests cursorial, ground-running animals rather than branch-perching climbers. The biomechanics of wing development in juvenile modern birds, who use their developing wings to help them run up steep slopes before they can fly, provides an intriguing model for how flight might have bootstrapped itself from running behaviour. The honest answer, arrived at carefully after decades of heated debate, is that the evidence currently supports neither hypothesis cleanly. It may be that different lineages took different paths. Microraptor, with its four wings and tree-dwelling lifestyle, may represent one evolutionary experiment with flight. The ancestors of modern birds may represent a different one, starting from a different ecological position and arriving at the same destination, powered flight, by a different route. This multiplicity of pathways is, in some ways, the most fascinating conclusion of all. Evolution does not have a single track. It explores possibilities simultaneously, in parallel, in ways that produce convergent outcomes through non-convergent routes. Birds exist because flight is an extraordinarily powerful ecological strategy. Once it is achieved, it opens up resource dimensions and habitat types unavailable to earthbound animals. But the path to that achievement was not a straight line. It was a forest of possibilities, most of which led nowhere in particular, and a few of which led here, to the birds that wake you with their singing in the morning, the descendants of animals that walked the Jurassic world on 2 feet and wore their evolutionary future in the feathers that covered their forearms. There is a long view of time available to you tonight if you want it, a view that sees the sparrow outside your window as something continuous with the great Jurassic theropods, different in scale, transformed beyond recognition, but carrying in their bones and feathers and air sacs and egg-laying the unmistakable signature of the lineage they come from. Every bird is a small living piece of the dinosaur era, still here, still flying, still, in their own way, incompletely understood. Rest in that knowledge for a moment. The dinosaurs are not entirely gone. They sing from telephone wires. They nest in your eaves. They are not a finished chapter. They are a story still unfolding, 230 million years after it began, in every flutter and call of every feathered creature alive today. If you could travel back in time to any moment in the Mesozoic era and look at the landscape, the thing that would probably strike you most forcibly, more than the dinosaurs, more than the pterosaurs wheeling overhead, more than the enormous dragonflies and the strange trees, is the colour. For most of the dinosaur era, the world was green. Not the varied, layered, flower-rich green of a modern forest, but a simpler, more uniform green. The green of ferns, cycads, Araucarian conifers, and tree ferns. A world without flowers, without fruit, without the riotous chromatic complexity that flowering plants have introduced to every ecosystem on Earth today. And then, sometime in the early Cretaceous, roughly 130 million years ago, though the precise timing is still being debated, something extraordinary happened. Flowering plants appeared. This event, which paleobotanists refer to as the angiosperm, radiation, angiosperm being the technical term for flowering plant, is one of the most significant and most poorly understood events in the history of life. It transformed every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth within a geologically brief interval of time. It created new opportunities for insects, birds, and mammals. It produced the majority of the food crops on which human civilization depends today. And its ultimate cause, the question of why angiosperms appeared when they did and why they spread so explosively once they appeared, is still not fully resolved. Charles Darwin himself recognized the angiosperm radiation as a major problem for evolutionary theory. He called it an abominable mystery in a letter written in 1879, and the phrase has stuck because the mystery is, in certain respects, still abominable. We know far more about it now than Darwin did, but we are still a long way from a complete understanding. Here is the problem in brief. Angiosperms, flowering, plants are, by almost any measure, the most spectacularly successful group of plants in Earth's history. There are roughly 350,000 described species of flowering plants today, representing perhaps 80 or 90% of all known land plant species. They have colonized every terrestrial habitat from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, From the driest deserts to the edges of the most frigid mountain ranges, they have developed an extraordinary diversity of strategies for pollination and seed dispersal, creating some of the most intricate and co-evolutionary relationships in all of biology. Yet in the fossil record, they appear somewhat suddenly. Prior to approximately 130 million years ago, angiosperms are absent or extremely rare in fossil assemblages. After that point, they proliferate with a speed that is genuinely startling. Within 20 or 30 million years, a blink of geological time, they go from absent to dominant in many habitats. What explains this explosive success? The conventional answer involves a combination of factors. Flowering plants evolved innovations in reproduction, enclosed seeds protected by ovaries, the development of the flower itself as an advertising structure to attract pollinators, that gave them advantages over the gymnosperms, conifers, cycads and their relatives, that dominated Mesozoic forests. Flowers attracted insects, and insects, in the process of seeking nectar, transferred pollen from plant to plant with a precision and efficiency that wine pollination could not match. The result was a system of mutual benefit. Insects got food, plants got reliable pollination that drove the co-evolution of both groups in positive feedback loops of spectacular diversity. Fruit, the fleshy covering that angiosperms developed around many of their seeds, created a similar partnership with animals that ate the fruit and dispersed the seeds through their digestive tracts. Dinosaurs, it is now believed, were likely important fruit and seed dispersers in Cretaceous ecosystems, eating the fruits of early angiosperms and depositing the seeds at distances from the parent plant that allowed for the rapid colonization of new territory. These partnerships are elegant and well supported, but they don't fully explain the timing. Why did angiosperms appear and spread when they did, rather than earlier or later? What held them back through the Triassic and Jurassic? What changed in the early Cretaceous that allowed them to establish and then explode? One hypothesis involves climate. The early Cretaceous was, in many regions, a period of increased seasonality and climate variability compared to the relatively stable greenhouse conditions of the late Jurassic. Flowering plants, which can complete their life cycles quickly, some annuals go from germination to seed production in a matter of weeks, may have been better suited to disturbed and seasonal environments than the slow-growing gymnosperms that dominated stable, mature forests. If climate change opened up disturbed habitats at the right time, angiosperms may have been able to establish and diversify in those marginal environments before spreading into more stable ones. Another hypothesis involves insects. Pollinating insects, particularly bees and their relatives, diversified during the same Cretaceous interval in which angiosperms were radiating. The two radiations appear to have been linked, pulling each other forward in time, each group's diversification enabling and accelerating the others. If pollinating insects reached a critical threshold of diversity and abundance at a particular moment in the early Cretaceous, this might have provided the ecological infrastructure that allowed flowering plants to take off. But there is also a more puzzling aspect of the angiosperm origin story. The very first angiosperms, the oldest unambiguous fossil flowers, are already quite diverse when we first encounter them in the record. They do not look like a single primitive form that has just emerged from its gymnosperm ancestor. They look like a group that has already been evolving for some time, already divided into multiple lineages with distinct characteristics. This suggests that the true origin of angiosperms, the first appearance of the defining features of the flowering plant body plan, predates the first good fossil record of flowers, perhaps by tens of millions of years, perhaps by more. Molecular clock estimates, calculations based on the rate of genetic change in the DNA of living plants, extrapolated backward in time, suggest that the angiosperm lineage may have originated in the Triassic or even earlier, hundreds of millions of years before it came to dominate the world's flora. If this is correct, then flowering plants were present, somewhere, somehow, in some small and marginal way, throughout the Triassic and Jurassic and early Cretaceous, without leaving any clear trace in the fossil record, hidden, cryptic, evolving in habitats that were not preserving their remains, and then, triggered by some combination of ecological and climatic opportunity, they emerged from obscurity and changed everything. This is a humbling possibility. One of the most consequential evolutionary events in the history of land life, the appearance of the organisms that produce most of the food on Earth today, may have been happening quietly and invisibly for tens or hundreds of millions of years before we can see evidence of it. The fossil record is incomplete in ways that we are still mapping. The silences in the record are not absences of life, they are simply absences of evidence, and absences of evidence are not evidence of absence. In the late Cretaceous, when angiosperms had begun their great radiation, but had not yet achieved the dominance they hold today, the world was a patchwork of habitats, dense conifer forests in the higher latitudes, their canopies so complete that little grew in their shade, fern and cycad lowlands in the tropics, hot and humid, rich with insect life, and threading through and around and between these older vegetation types, the new arrivals, the flowering plants, low-growing and opportunistic at first, creeping into gaps and disturbed ground, beginning the patient work of transformation that would, over millions of years, recolour the world. Dinosaurs moved through this changing world without, presumably, any awareness that everything was shifting. A hadrosaur feeding on leaves in a late Cretaceous floodplain might eat both conifer foliage and angiosperm leaves in the same day. A small mammal foraging on the forest floor might eat seeds from gymnosperms and angiosperms indifferently, its digestive chemistry making no distinction. The transformation of the plant world was happening on timescales that no single generation of any species could perceive, but it was happening steadily, incrementally, relentlessly. The flowers were coming, the fruits were coming, the world was learning to be colourful, and all of it, the origin, the timing, the mechanism, remains, as Darwin recognised, at least partially mysterious. The abominable mystery of Darwin's letter has been substantially reduced in the century and a half since he wrote it, but it has not been solved, not completely, not yet. As you drift now, let yourself imagine that world in transition. The Cretaceous landscape somewhere in what will one day be North America or Asia, on a warm afternoon perhaps 100 million years ago. The dominant trees are conifers, tall and aromatic, their needle-covered branches casting dappled shade across a forest floor rich with ferns. And there, at the edge of a stream where the light reaches the ground more easily, something small and unfamiliar. A plant with broad, flat leaves, and at the tip of one branch something that the world has never seen before, a flower. Small, perhaps white or pale yellow, opening in the afternoon warmth, drawing in with its scent and its colour an insect that has never encountered anything quite like it. The beginning of something, the beginning of the world as we know it. There is a story that many people carry about dinosaurs without quite realising they carry it. It is a story of warmth and lushness, of tropical conditions, of a world where every landscape was something like a modern jungle, hot, humid, green, teeming. The dinosaurs of this story live in a world without seasons, without cold, without the kind of privation that tests animals to their limits. This story is wrong, or rather, it is incomplete in ways that change everything. We now know, with considerable certainty, that dinosaurs lived at the poles. Not occasionally, not as brief seasonal visitors following food sources toward high latitudes in summer and retreating in winter, but permanently, year-round, in environments that experienced months of complete polar darkness every winter. In environments that were, by the standards of the Mesozoic, genuinely cold, not Arctic-level cold as we know it today, since the Mesozoic was a greenhouse world with no polar ice caps, but cold enough, dark enough, and nutritionally challenging enough that the question of how they survived is not trivial. The evidence began accumulating in the 1970s and 1980s, when paleontologists working in Alaska, specifically in the Prince Creek Formation of the North Slope, began recovering dinosaur fossils at paleolatitudes that, at the time of deposition roughly 68 to 70 million years ago, would have placed them at approximately 80 degrees north, above the Arctic Circle, well within the zone of winter polar darkness. At first, many researchers assumed these must be migratory animals. Modern caribou migrate enormous distances seasonally in the Arctic, and it seemed reasonable to suppose that late Cretaceous dinosaurs might have done something similar, breeding at high latitudes in summer when the sun never set and vegetation was abundant, then moving south as winter approached and the light failed. But then the fossils began to tell a different story. Among the North Slope dinosaur remains were juveniles, newly hatched or very young animals, that could not possibly have survived a long migration. hatchling hadrosaurs and ceratopsians were found in polar sediments, suggesting that these animals were not just passing through, but were actually reproducing at these extreme latitudes. And reproducing means staying, being there in spring when nesting season began, being there through the summer, remaining or returning in cycles that made the North Slope a permanent part of their range. The polar environment during the late Cretaceous was profoundly different from the Arctic today. There were no ice caps. Global temperatures were warmer by perhaps 10 or 15 degrees Celsius on average. The polar regions received substantial rainfall during the long summer days when the sun circled the horizon rather than rising and setting. Vegetation grew, if not luxuriantly, at least abundantly enough to support large herds of herbivores. But winter still came, and in winter, at 80 degrees north, the sun disappeared for months. Temperatures dropped, perhaps to levels that would be uncomfortably cold by the standards of the warm-adapted dinosaurs that dominated lower latitudes. Vegetation died back, food became scarce. The hadrosaurs of the North Slope, animals belonging to genera like Edmontosaurus and Ugranaluk, the latter a species known only from the North Slope and apparently adapted to polar conditions, faced this challenge every year of their lives. The question of how they met it is one that paleontologists are still actively investigating. One possibility is behavioural. If these dinosaurs were capable of tolerating cold temperatures, if their metabolic rates, body insulation, and physiological flexibility allowed them to remain active in conditions that would paralyse a cold-blooded reptile, then they might have continued foraging through the polar winter on whatever dried vegetation, bark, or other plant matter remained available. Large herbivores today in cold climates like musk oxen and reindeer do exactly this. They use their large body size to maintain core temperature while foraging on marginal food sources through the winter. The hadrosaurs of the North Slope, which could reach body masses of several tons, were well positioned to do the same. Another possibility is physiological dormancy, a form of hibernation or torpor. Some modern reptiles and amphibians survive cold seasons by dramatically lowering their metabolic rates, their heart rates, their body temperatures, and essentially waiting for better conditions. Could dinosaurs have done something similar? The bone histology evidence from polar dinosaur specimens, the microscopic structure of the bone, which reflects growth patterns and metabolic activity, is somewhat ambiguous on this point. Some researchers argue that the bone structure is consistent with regular periods of reduced growth, which might reflect seasonal dormancy. Others disagree. But there is a third possibility that has attracted growing interest, and it has to do with the fundamental question of dinosaur warm-bloodedness that we touched on earlier. If dinosaurs were genuinely endothermic, generating their own body heat internally, like modern birds and mammals, then polar living was simply a matter of adequate insulation and sufficient food. The metabolic machinery was already there, having evolved for other reasons. The polar environment was just another challenge to be solved with the tools already available. The discovery of feathers on multiple lineages has strengthened this hypothesis. Feathers are the best-known biological, insulating material on Earth. A bird of comparable size to a polar dinosaur, coated in an effective feathery insulation, can survive Arctic winters with relative ease. If theropod dinosaurs and their relatives had similar insulation, the polar environment becomes much more tractable, and there are polar dinosaurs on the other end of the planet as well. Cretaceous fossil sites in what is now southeastern Australia, at paleolatitudes of roughly 75 to 80 degrees south during the time of deposition, have yielded the remains of hypsilophodontid dinosaurs, small bipedal herbivores that also lived at high latitudes year-round. The Dinosaur Cove site in Victoria, excavated with enormous difficulty from the cliff face of a sea-eroded coastline over many years beginning in the 1980s, has produced fossils of animals that would have experienced the same seasonal darkness and cold as their northern counterparts. These southern polar dinosaurs were small, most of them, perhaps 60 to 80 centimetres tall, roughly the size of a large chicken, and their large eyes, reconstructed from the size of the orbit in the skull, suggest adaptations for low-light conditions. Larger eyes gather more light. In an environment where the sun is either absent or very low in the sky for months at a time, enhanced visual capability would be a significant advantage. The image that emerges from all of this evidence is of an ancient world with a complexity and hardship that is easy to miss when we focus on the dramatic, sun-drenched landscapes of the dinosaur reconstructions we grew up with. Dinosaurs were not merely tropical animals enjoying an endless warm summer. They were adaptable, physiologically sophisticated organisms that had spread into every available habitat, from equatorial forest to polar darkness, and were managing to make a living in all of them. This speaks to something important about the nature of the dinosaur lineage. It was not just successful because it happened to find a comfortable niche and stay there. It was successful because it was flexible, because its basic body plan and physiology allowed for modification and adaptation across an extraordinary range of conditions. A group of animals that can live comfortably both at the equator and at 80 degrees north is a group of animals with genuine ecological breadth, a group capable of surviving whatever changes the environment throws at it. Until, of course, the environment throws something unprecedented, something that no amount of physiological flexibility and ecological breadth can prepare for. But we are not at that chapter yet. For now, let us stay in the long, productive, astonishing middle of the dinosaur story. Let us stay in the cold, dark polar winter, with the small-eyed, large-brained dinosaurs picking their way through the low vegetation, finding food in the semi-darkness, surviving the impossible, making it through to the spring. There is something deeply quiet about a polar night, the stillness of it. The way sound carries differently when the air is cold and the vegetation has died back and nothing is moving very quickly. A polar dinosaur picking its way through winter undergrowth 68 million years ago would have moved through silence mostly, through the thin cries of whatever birds were already present at high latitudes, through the sound of wind moving over frozen ground. Let that silence come to you now, the ancient silence of a world mostly unmade and unmeasured, the quiet of deep time. So far we have been dealing with mysteries that are, at least in principle, solvable. Questions about physiology, ecology and evolution where the evidence is incomplete but the scientific framework is clear. Now let us venture into stranger territory. Let us look at some of the specific dinosaurs and dinosaur features that have generated the most genuine head-scratching among the researchers who study them. Animals, and anatomical features so unusual that even with all our modern tools and methods, we are not entirely sure what we are looking at. We begin with Spinosaurus. If you had to design a dinosaur that made no obvious evolutionary sense, you might produce something like Spinosaurus. It was enormous. Estimates of its body length range from 14 to 18 meters, potentially making it the largest known carnivorous dinosaur, edging out even Tyrannosaurus rex. It lived in North Africa during the Middle Cretaceous, approximately 95 to 100 million years ago, in a world of river channels, mangroves and tidal flats that was, unlike the familiar semi-arid habitat of many famous dinosaurs, a water-dominated landscape of extraordinary richness. The most immediately striking thing about Spinosaurus is its sail, or hump, or whatever it was. The neural spines, the upward extensions of the vertebrae that run along the back, in Spinosaurus were extraordinarily elongated, reaching heights of up to 2 meters above the level of the backbone. Nothing else quite like them exists in any other vertebrate animal. In early reconstructions, researchers assumed they supported a skin sail, similar to the much smaller but structurally analogous sails of the much older Permian reptiles Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus. The sail hypothesis suggested thermoregulation, a large surface area for absorbing or radiating heat, but more recent analyses of the bone structure of the spine suggest they were too thick and too heavily cross-braced to function as simple sail supports. They may instead have supported a large muscular hump, like a bison's shoulder hump but far taller. The function of a muscle-filled hump of this kind is quite different from a sail, energy storage perhaps, or load-bearing for a specific posture, or some other biomechanical purpose that we have not yet identified. The debate is genuinely unresolved. Paleontologists who have studied the Spinosaurus material have landed in different camps, and the positions have sometimes been argued with unusual vigour for the generally low-key world of vertebrate paleontology. The sail versus hump question remains open. But the sails are only the beginning of the Spinosaurus mystery, because in 2014, a remarkably complete set of Spinosaurus remains was described from Morocco, including the first good evidence of the hind limbs, and the hind limbs were startling. They were short, dramatically short for an animal of this body size, shorter than the forelimbs in a way that no other large theropod displayed. The result was an animal that, standing upright, would have been deeply uncomfortable on 2 legs. That would have seemed designed almost for a posture closer to horizontal, with the forelimbs taking a significant portion of the body's weight. Combined with the long crocodilian skull with its conical interlocking teeth, perfectly suited for catching fish, and the isotopic evidence from the teeth suggesting a diet based largely on aquatic prey, these short hind limbs suggested an animal that was primarily semi-aquatic. An enormous, sail-backed crocodile-skulled dinosaur that spent most of its time in the water, paddling through rivers and coastal channels, plunging that narrow skull into the water to seize fish with those conical teeth. But then, in 2020, a study of Spinosaurus tail vertebrae produced another surprise. The tail was paddle-like, tall, flexible, filled with muscles arranged in a pattern that would produce an efficient undulating swimming stroke. It was not the tail of an animal that occasionally waded. It was the tail of an animal that genuinely swam, that used its tail as a primary propulsive organ in the water, in the same way that modern crocodilians do. This was extraordinary. No other large theropod dinosaur is believed to have been aquatic in this way. Spinosaurus appears to be a genuine evolutionary outlier, a member of a group defined by terrestrial bipedalism that went, over millions of years, in a dramatically different direction. Into the water, onto four limbs, toward a lifestyle more like a giant otter or a crocodile than like anything we normally associate with theropod dinosaurs. How and why? What selective pressures drove a lineage of terrestrial bipeds toward the water with such thoroughness? The ecosystem evidence from the Kem beds of Morocco and the Bahariya Formation of Egypt, where Spinosaurus lived, suggests a world almost hyperbolically rich in aquatic prey. Enormous lobe-finned fish, lungfish, coelacanths, giant sawfish, all sharing a world of river channels and floodplains so vast and fish-rich that a semi-aquatic giant carnivore was a viable ecological strategy. But Spinosaurus was not alone in this ecosystem. Other large carnivores, Carcharodontosaurus, a giant theropod that competed for terrestrial prey, lived in the same region at roughly the same time. Competition with terrestrial carnivores may have pushed the Spinosaurid lineage toward the water, where the food was abundant and the competition was less intense. This kind of ecological displacement driving habitat shift and body plan change is well documented in other vertebrate groups. Yet the specifics of the Spinosaurus story, the sail, the short legs, the paddle tail, are still generating debate. New specimens, new analyses, and new computational models continue to produce refinements and occasionally reversals in the picture. Spinosaurus is not a solved problem. It is an ongoing investigation into one of the strangest animals that ever lived. And Spinosaurus is not alone among the genuinely inexplicable dinosaurs. Consider therizinosaurs. These were large theropods, technically in the same broad group as T-Rex and Velociraptor, but they had abandoned the carnivory that defines most of the theropod lineage and become herbivores. Not just herbivores, but herbivores with the most astonishing set of claws in the history of vertebrate life. The forelimb claws of Therizinosaurus itself were up to 90 centimeters long, 3 feet of curved keratin extending from a hand that was clearly designed for grasping and pulling, not for killing prey. What were they for? The best hypothesis is that they were used to pull branches and entire small trees toward the animal's small beak-like snout, which shows clear adaptations for processing plant material, but the scale of the claws seems excessive even for this purpose. Were they also used for defense against predators, for territorial displays, for digging, for some combination of purposes that we have not fully reconstructed? We do not know. And then there is Iguanodon, one of the first dinosaurs ever named, and one of the most extensively studied, whose thumb spike, a conical pointed bony structure on the first digit of the hand, was initially mistakenly placed on the animal's nose, resulting in the famous early reconstructions that gave Iguanodon a rhinoceros-like horn, and is still, after nearly 2 centuries of study, the subject of debate about its precise function. There is Pachycephalosaurus, the dome-headed dinosaur with a skull roof up to 25 centimeters of solid bone. The obvious interpretation, that the dome was used for headbutting in intraspecific combat like bighorn sheep, has been challenged by biomechanical analyses suggesting that the skull architecture is not optimized for axial loading. Headbutting, at least in the way we imagine it, might have caused fatal brain injury rather than merely determining social hierarchy. Other researchers argue that the bone histology of the dome indicates sufficient shock-absorbing capacity to make headbutting viable. The debate is unresolved. There is Nigersaurus, the Cretaceous sauropod from Niger with a skull so wide and so low to the ground, and a dental battery so extensive and so unusual that it appears to have been a specialized lawnmower, vacuum cleaner, for ground-level vegetation, holding its head parallel to the ground and moving through low-growing plants like a very large ruminant. But the physics of how it held that enormous neck in such a position, and why the skull evolved such an extreme shape, is still not fully explained. These animals, Spinosaurus, Therizinosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Nigersaurus, and dozens of others that could fill a much longer list, are reminders that the dinosaur clade was not a collection of variations on a single theme. It was a vast and diverse experiment in vertebrate body plans, and many of the experiments produced animals that had no precise analogues in any other era of life's history. Animals so strange that, even with complete skeletons and detailed soft tissue impressions and isotopic chemical data, we still struggle to reconstruct what their lives actually looked like. The mysteries embedded in these strange animals are not failures of science. They are simply evidence of how much the dinosaur lineage explored, how many possibilities it tried, how far outside ordinary biological space some of those explorations went. There is no shame in not knowing. There is only the quiet pleasure of the question, still open, still alive, still waiting. And now we come to the chapter that has fascinated and haunted people since the first dinosaur bones were recognized for what they were. The end, or not exactly the end, the moment before the end, the late Cretaceous, in the last few million years before the asteroid struck and the world changed forever. Because here too there are mysteries. Not just the mystery of the extinction itself, the mechanics of how a bolide impact could have killed so thoroughly and so globally, but the deeper, stranger mystery of what was happening to dinosaur populations in the millions of years before the impact. A mystery that touches on fundamental questions about the dynamics of evolutionary success and failure, about how ecosystems change over geological time, and about whether the great dinosaur extinction was truly a sudden catastrophe or something more complicated. Let us begin with what we know. 66 million years ago, an asteroid approximately 10 kilometers in diameter struck the shallow sea that is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The energy released was equivalent to billions of nuclear warheads detonating simultaneously. The initial impact crater was perhaps 200 kilometers across. The material ejected into the atmosphere: pulverized rock, vaporized ocean water, soot from the wildfires that burned across entire continents, formed a global layer of aerosols that dramatically reduced sunlight reaching Earth's surface for months to years after the impact. The consequences were swift and catastrophic. Photosynthesis slowed dramatically, then effectively stopped in many regions. Food chains dependent on living, plants collapsed. Animals that could not survive on dormant seeds or existing stored energy died. The non-avian dinosaurs, all of them, across every continent and every size class and every ecological category, disappeared from the fossil record at this boundary with a completeness that is, in geological terms, effectively instantaneous. This part of the story is well established and not seriously disputed by any mainstream researcher. The asteroid impact happened. It was catastrophic. The non-avian dinosaurs did not survive it. But the mystery, the genuinely unsettled, actively debated scientific question, is about what was happening to dinosaurs in the millions of years leading up to the impact. Were they thriving? Were they declining? Were they already in trouble for independent reasons when the asteroid arrived? The answer matters, because it changes the story in important ways. If dinosaurs were ecologically vigorous and evolutionarily diverse right up to the moment the asteroid struck, then the extinction was purely a matter of bad luck, a healthy, successful dynasty cut down by an external catastrophe that nothing could have prepared for or survived. If, on the other hand, dinosaurs were already declining, if the richness and diversity of the late Cretaceous dinosaur fauna was decreasing, if extinction rates were exceeding speciation rates, if the overall ecological dominance of dinosaurs was weakening, then the asteroid may have delivered the killing blow to a patient already in poor health. The cause of death was still the asteroid, but the narrative context is different. This is not a trivial distinction. It bears on questions about the long-term sustainability of the dinosaur body plan, about whether something about the late Cretaceous world, climate changes, vegetation changes, sea level changes was creating conditions that dinosaurs were struggling to adapt to. About whether the age of dinosaurs was, in some sense already, approaching its natural endpoint, independent of any external catastrophe. The evidence for pre-impact dinosaur decline is real but contested. Analyses of diversity curves, counts of the number of distinct dinosaur species or genera represented at different time intervals in the late Cretaceous, have produced conflicting results depending on the datasets used, the time intervals analysed, and the methods applied. Some analyses show clear declining diversity in the last few million years before the impact. Others show no statistically significant trend. Still others show declining diversity in some lineages and stable or increasing diversity in others. Part of the problem is the senior lips effect, a phenomenon in fossil data analysis whereby even an instantaneous mass extinction produces an apparent gradual decline in the fossil record simply because the last individual of any given species is unlikely to be the last individual preserved as a fossil. The fossil record of any given species will appear to end before the species actually went extinct, creating an artificial ghost of gradual decline even for sudden extinctions. Controlling for this effect is methodologically difficult, and the last universal Cretaceous boundary faunas, the assemblages of dinosaur species preserved in the last 1 to 2 million years before the impact, are known from a limited number of geographic regions, primarily the Hell Creek Formation and related units in the western interior of North America. We simply do not have adequate data from other regions of the world to know whether the North American patterns reflect a global trend or a regional one. The Hell Creek evidence itself is interesting and equivocal. In the latest Cretaceous deposits of this formation, dinosaur diversity was lower than it had been in earlier late Cretaceous times. A handful of large species, Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, dominated the fauna in the final million years, with relatively few medium-sized forms. Was this a sign of declining ecosystem health, or was it a sampling artifact? Was the North American dinosaur fauna in the final stages of a natural turnover, with the latest forms simply less diverse because some of the earlier species had already been replaced? Paleontologists Mark Norell, David Fostovsky and others have argued that the evidence does not support a pre-impact decline, that the apparent loss of diversity in the Hell Creek Formation reflects the ecology of that particular environment, a floodplain ecosystem in a particular region at a particular time, rather than a global trend. Others, including Steve Broussard and colleagues, have published work suggesting that at least some major dinosaur groups show declining diversification rates well before the impact. The debate is productive and ongoing, and hovering over it is the question of what was actually changing in the late Cretaceous environment. The latest Cretaceous was a period of significant geological activity. The Deccan Traps, a massive flood basalt province in what is now India, were erupting throughout the late Maastrichtian stage, the geological age that immediately precedes the KPG boundary. These eruptions were releasing enormous quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, driving climate fluctuations that may have stressed ecosystems globally. The Western Interior Seaway, a shallow inland sea that divided North America longitudinally for much of the Cretaceous, creating separate eastern and western land masses with distinct faunas, was retreating as sea levels fell, opening up land connections that could drive species migrations and competition. The vegetation was changing too. Flowering plants had been diversifying throughout the Cretaceous, and by the latest Maastrichtian, they were significantly changing the character of plant communities in many regions. The high diversity, conifer and cycad flora of the earlier Cretaceous was giving way to increasingly angiosperm-dominated vegetation, and the dietary and digestive adaptations of different dinosaur groups may have tracked these changes with varying success. In short, the world of the latest Cretaceous was already in flux before the asteroid arrived. Whether that flux was pushing dinosaurs toward a tipping point, or whether they were riding the changes successfully, we genuinely cannot say with confidence. The data are there, scattered in rocks around the world, waiting to be found and analysed. But we have not found enough of them yet, and analysed them with sufficient precision to answer the question definitively. What we do know is this. In the geologically brief moment of the KPG impact and its immediate aftermath, the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared. Every single lineage, every single continent, every single ecological category. Gone. The birds, the avian dinosaur, survived, apparently due to a combination of small body size, flexible diet, and the ability to exploit the degraded post-impact environment on seeds and other stored energy sources. But everything else was extinguished, and in the silence that followed, the ecological silence of a world stripped of its dominant large animals, something new began to stir. Small, warm-blooded, mostly nocturnal creatures that had been living in the shadows of the dinosaur world for over 150 million years. Animals with fur and milk and live births and complex social behaviours and large brains relative to body size. Animals whose evolutionary trajectory, until that moment, had been profoundly constrained by the dinosaurian world they inhabited. Our ancestors, your ancestors. Every mammal alive today, from the blue whale to the shrew, from the elephant to the bat, descended from those small, unassuming survivors of the most extraordinary catastrophe in the history of large land animals. We are here because the dinosaurs were not, and the dinosaurs are not here, the non-avian dinosaurs, the giant rulers of the Mesozoic, because of an asteroid, and possibly also because of a world that was, in some ways we do not fully understand, already changing around them. The mystery of the end is, in this sense, inseparable from the mystery of the beginning of our own story. We cannot fully understand why the dinosaurs disappeared without understanding the world they disappeared from. And that world, its ecosystems, its climate fluctuations, its shifting vegetation, is still being reconstructed, layer by patient geological layer, from the rocks that preserve its evidence. Let that sit quietly now. The great transition, the world before and the world after and the thin, terrible boundary between them, a moment that changed everything for every living thing on Earth, including us, including our most distant ancestors who crawled out from hiding in the days after the impact and looked at a world changed beyond recognition and began, tentatively, to inhabit it. They did not know what they were inheriting, they could not have known, but they survived, and they diversified, and 66 million years later, here we are, trying to understand the world that came before, piecing together the story of the animals that ruled that world, sitting with the mystery of a lineage so successful, so diverse, so long-lasting, and yet so completely and utterly gone, except for the birds who are still here and who remind us, if we listen carefully, that the story is not quite over yet. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the scorched, recovering world of the early Triassic, through the explosive diversification of the Middle Jurassic, past the giants of the Jurassic Plains and the flowering revolution of the Cretaceous, through polar darkness and feathered arms reaching toward the sky, to the final, cataclysmic moment of the KPG extinction. We have stopped again and again at the places where our knowledge thins, where the fossil record grows sparse, where the questions multiply faster than the answers, where the honest scientific position is we don't fully know. Now let us take a moment to gather those open questions, to hold them together, gently, and appreciate them for what they are. Because there is a kind of beauty in what we don't know, not the frustrated, anxious beauty of incompleteness, but the quiet, spacious beauty of a horizon that keeps receding as you walk toward it. Science advances, discoveries are made. Each decade brings new techniques, new fossil sites, new analytical tools that reveal things the previous generation could not have imagined. And yet the fundamental questions, the deepest, most important questions about how life works and why it takes the forms it does, remain open in ways that ensure the work will never be finished. Here, then, is a partial inventory of what remains unknown about the dinosaur era, not a catalogue of failure, but a map of the frontier. We do not know, with any precision, when dinosaurs first became warm-blooded. The physiological and anatomical evidence strongly suggests that at least some lineages were fully endothermic, generating their own body heat internally by the Middle or Late Jurassic. But whether this was a state they inherited from their earliest ancestors, or one they evolved gradually over millions of years from a partly or fully ectothermic ancestral condition, is still debated. The answer matters because it shapes our understanding of how early dinosaurs competed with other archosaurs, whether their metabolic advantage, if any, was present from the start or emerged later. We do not know why sauropods grew so large. We have hypotheses, good ones, that involve respiratory efficiency, skeletal weight reduction, and dietary strategies. But the combination of factors that allowed some lineages to exceed 60 or 70 tons while Others in the same ecosystem remained far smaller is not fully explained. The existence of multiple, apparently independent origins of giant body size in different sauropod lineages across different time periods and on different continents suggests that something about the sauropod body plan made extreme gigantism not merely possible, but repeatedly favoured by natural selection. What that something is, beyond the general factors already identified, is unclear. We do not know the full story of feather evolution. We know feathers were widespread in the theropod lineage and possibly in other dinosaur lineages as well. We know they served multiple functions: insulation, display, and eventually aerodynamics. We know that multiple lineages may have independently experimented with flight or gliding. But the precise sequence of events, which lineage first developed the feather morphology associated with flight, which environment those first flight experiments took place in, and why only one lineage succeeded in giving rise to the modern bird radiation, remains uncertain. We do not know why the angiosperms appeared when they did. The abominable mystery that Darwin identified has been substantially illuminated by modern research, but the ultimate trigger for the explosive success of flowering plants, the specific combination of ecological, climatic, and evolutionary circumstances that allowed them to emerge from obscurity and rapidly dominate the world's flora, is still not fully explained. And the mystery of where angiosperms were hiding before the early Cretaceous, whether they existed for tens or hundreds of millions of years in habitats that did not preserve their fossils, is one of the most tantalizing in all of paleobotany. We do not know the full complexity of dinosaur behavior. The fossil record preserves anatomy. It occasionally preserves footprints, nests, eggs, and feeding traces. But behavior, the rich, complex, socially organized behavior that we see in living birds and infer from the biological sophistication of dinosaurian anatomy, is almost entirely invisible to us. Did large theropods have complex social hierarchies? Did sauropods have home ranges and migratory routes? Did hadrosaurs communicate with calls and displays as sophisticated as those of modern birds? We simply do not know. We can make inferences, some of them quite well supported. But the behavioural richness of dinosaur life, the full, lived reality of what it was like to be a Triceratops or an Allosaurus, is beyond our ability to reconstruct. We do not fully understand the mid-Cretaceous diversity event, the extraordinary proliferation of dinosaur species that occurred in certain lineages during the Cretaceous. Ceratopsian dinosaurs, for example, went from a small number of species in the early Cretaceous to an astonishing diversity of forms in the late Cretaceous, developing horns, frills, and skull ornaments in an almost bewildering variety of configurations. What drove this diversification? Was it primarily sexual selection, an arms race of display structures driven by mate choice? Was it driven by the diversification of the vegetation they ate? Was it related to the geographic fragmentation of their habitat? All three hypotheses have support. None is fully satisfying on its own. We do not know the full colour palette of the dinosaur world. Recent advances in reconstructing the colours of feathered dinosaurs from the preserved melanosomes in their fossil feathers have been genuinely exciting. We now know, with reasonable confidence, the black and white and rust coloration of Anchiornis, the iridescent black of Microraptor's feathers, and a handful of other specific cases. But for the majority of dinosaur species, those without preserved feathers, or those from which melanosomes have not been successfully extracted, colour remains unknown. Whether large, non-feathered or lightly feathered, dinosaurs cryptically coloured, like modern crocodiles, brightly patterned, like some modern lizards? We cannot say. We do not know the full extent of the KPG extinction selectivity. Why did birds survive when other avian-grade dinosaurs did not? Why did crocodilians survive when other archosaurs perished? Why did turtles come through with relatively little damage when other similarly sized reptiles were devastated? The selectivity of the KPG extinction, who died and who survived, reflects some combination of body size, diet, habitat, and metabolic strategy that we have been able to reconstruct only partially. The full picture of survival and extinction at the KPG boundary is still being assembled from fossil evidence and from the biology of the survivors' modern descendants. These are not small questions. They are some of the most fundamental questions in the history of life on Earth, and they are open, actively, productively open, being worked on right now tonight by researchers in laboratories and field camps on every continent, using tools that did not exist a decade ago and asking questions that could not have been framed without the knowledge accumulated in the decades before. Science is not a finished library. It is a conversation with the evidence. And the evidence from the dinosaur era, 180 million years of life on an evolving planet, is inexhaustible. There will always be more fossils to find, more rock layers to analyze, more genomes of living relatives to sequence and compare, more techniques to apply, and more questions to ask. The mystery of the dinosaur era is not a problem to be solved and set aside. It is a relationship, an ongoing, evolving, never complete relationship between the present and the deep past, between the scientists who devote their lives to it and the ancient animals they are trying to understand, between all of us, curious, wondering, small by comparison, and the immensity of everything that came before. Let that feeling rest gently on you now, the quiet wonder of the open question, the deep, sustaining peace that comes from knowing that the world is larger and older and more full of wonder than any single mind can contain. You're small in the scheme of things, we all are, and that is not a frightening thought. It is in the softness of this night a deeply restful one. The ancient world does not require your engagement to continue being ancient. It does not need you to solve it. It only asks on nights like this that you take a moment to notice it, to let it exist at the edge of your awareness, vast, patient, extraordinary, and alive in the only way the past can be alive, in the memory of a species descended from the survivors of its most catastrophic moments, still here, still wondering, still listening. There is a conversation that living things are having with us, if we know how to listen. Every organism alive today is a message from the past. Biological letter written in DNA and bone and behaviour, transmitted across millions of years, still legible if you know the alphabet. The birds are the most obvious message. 2 living species of every 3 on Earth today that are closely related to dinosaurs. The birds are not just relatives of dinosaurs, they are dinosaurs. Avian dinosaurs, theropods with feathers and air sacs and wishbones and complex social behaviours, nesting in trees and cliffs and burrows and every available surface on this planet's surface. When you hear a crow solve a puzzle, you're watching a dinosaurian brain at work. When you see a hawk plummet from altitude with its wings folded close against its body, you're watching the aerodynamic principles that the Cretaceous theropod lineage refined over millions of years. When a pigeon walks with that characteristic forward lunging head bob, you're watching a locomotory behaviour that has roots deep in the Jurassic. But birds are not the only living fossils of the dinosaur world. Crocodilians, crocodiles, alligators, gharials, caimans are the other surviving archosaur lineage, the close relatives of dinosaurs that have persisted in their ancient form, with remarkably little change in basic body plan, for over 80 million years. Modern crocodilians are, in an important sense, extraordinarily conservative animals. Their basic design, armour-plated body, powerful tail, ambush predation, excellent sensory apparatus, complex social behaviour, surprisingly sophisticated parental care, was set by the Cretaceous and has not needed fundamental revision since. This conservatism is itself a mystery of sorts. Why have crocodilians remained so morphologically stable while birds, the other surviving archosaur lineage, have diversified into thousands of species with an extraordinary range of body plans? The answer, presumably, involves the particular excellence of the crocodilian design for the semi-aquatic ambush predator niche. An animal that is essentially perfect for what it does has little evolutionary pressure to change, and crocodilians, occupying the edges of freshwater systems on every tropical and subtropical continent, have had relatively little competition for their specific ecological role. But the stability of crocodilian form should not be mistaken for evolutionary stasis. Crocodilians have changed, in detail, in behavioural sophistication, in the specific adaptations of different lineages to different environments. Modern saltwater crocodiles, which can survive in marine environments and have crossed open ocean to colonise islands, represent a behavioural and physiological flexibility that their Cretaceous ancestors may not have possessed in the same form. American alligators, which survive in climates where winter temperatures regularly drop to near freezing, sometimes going so far as to allow themselves to be partially frozen in ice while keeping their nostrils above the surface, have cold-tolerant strategies that may be more refined than those of their tropical relatives. The living archosaurs are, in this sense, still experimenting, still exploring the edges of what their body plans allow. 80 million years of additional evolution layered on top of the Mesozoic foundation has produced animals that are recognizably ancient and yet genuinely contemporary. Crocodilians that carry the anatomical heritage of the Triassic, while displaying behavioral complexity that rivals many mammals. And then there are the other survivors, the animals that are not archosaurs but that shared the Mesozoic world with dinosaurs and are still here, still living, still connecting the modern world to the ancient one. Turtles are among the most extraordinary of these. The basic turtle body plan, a bony shell enclosing the body, the only tetrapod with its shoulder girdle inside its ribcage, appeared in the Triassic and has not changed in its fundamental architecture since. Modern turtles are recognizably the same kind of animal as the earliest known turtles from 230 million years ago. They survived the KP extinction. They survived the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. They survived every major climate change and ecological disruption of the past 230 million years, and they are here today in over 300 species on every continent except Antarctica. Their longevity is extraordinary, and their secret appears to be the same as the crocodilians, a design so well suited to its purpose that improvement is difficult. The turtle shell is a triumph of defensive engineering, a structure that has cost these animals some speed and flexibility, but has provided protection against predators that few other designs can match. A turtle that can withdraw into its shell is, effectively, invulnerable to most predation. The evolutionary investment in the shell was enormous, the anatomical reorganization required to move. The shoulder girdle inside the ribcage involved extraordinary developmental changes, but the return on that investment has been spectacular. Sharks are another category. Modern sharks, or at least the general shark body plan, the cartilaginous skeleton with its multiple gill slits and its sensory lateral line, appeared more than 400 million years ago, well before the dinosaurs, and has been continuously present in the world's oceans ever since. The specific species of shark alive today are not those ancient ones. Species turn over, but the design has been stable enough, effective enough, to persist across 5 mass extinctions, through every catastrophic upheaval that has disrupted marine life into the present. And there are, of course, the horseshoe crabs, the nautiluses, the coelacanth, that extraordinary fish rediscovered alive in 1938 after being known only from fossils and believed extinct for 65 million years. These animals, sometimes called living fossils, though the term is imprecise and somewhat misleading, represent designs that have persisted with remarkable stability across geological time. They are not windows into the past so much as they are demonstrations of a principle, that sometimes, in the right ecological circumstances, an evolutionary design achieves a form so well adapted to its environment that the pressure to change is minimal. These animals are not frozen in amber, they are alive, and they continue to evolve. But they do so slowly, and the changes they accumulate leave the fundamental design intact. What do all these survivors tell us about the dinosaur era and the mysteries it contains? Perhaps this, that the criteria for survival across geological time are not always what we might expect. The biggest, the most dominant, the most ecologically central, these are not necessarily the most durable. The dinosaurs were all of those things for 165 million years, and they are gone. Mostly. The turtles, smaller and slower and seemingly more vulnerable, are still here. The sharks, ancient and unchanging in their essentials, are still here. The crocodilians, relatives of the very dinosaurs that ruled the Mesozoic, outlasted their more spectacular cousins. The lesson is not, I think, a lesson about strength or weakness. It is a lesson about fit, about how well an organism's design matches the range of environments it is likely to encounter over geological time. Specialists excel in the environments they are specialized for and go extinct when those environments change. Generalists with flexible designs persist across a wider range of conditions at the cost of never being optimally suited to any single one. The non-avian dinosaurs were, in many respects, extraordinary specialists, adapted for dominance in a particular set of Mesozoic ecosystems that no longer exist. When those ecosystems were devastated by the KPG impact, the specializations that had made them so successful in the old world became liabilities in the new one. The survivors, birds, crocodilians, turtles, mammals, were either generalists or small enough and metabolically flexible enough to find resources in the disrupted post-impact world. This is not a comfortable lesson, if you think about it too carefully. It suggests that the most successful lineages of any era are not necessarily the ones best positioned to survive the next catastrophe. That success can be its own vulnerability, that the very adaptations that allow a group to dominate can also, under the right conditions, seal its fate. But let us not dwell on the uncomfortable implications tonight. Let us instead appreciate the survivors for what they are, living connections to the ancient world, biological threads running from the deep Mesozoic into the present, available for anyone to observe who takes the time to look. The crow on the telephone wire turning its head with that particular quick intelligence, the vestige of a long theropod neck visible in the movement. The alligator lying motionless in a Florida wetland, every external feature unchanged from its Cretaceous relatives, patience evolved to its most extreme expression. The leatherback sea turtle, enormous and ancient and improbably graceful in the water, carrying its Triassic design into the 21st century oceans, navigating by magnetic fields in the same way its distant ancestors may have navigated across the Mesozoic seas. These animals do not know they are ancient. They do not carry the weight of their evolutionary history as a burden. They simply live, as all animals do, in the present, in the moment, in the particular environment they find themselves in, using the tools their long lineage has provided them with. There is something to learn from that, something about presence, about the sufficiency of the moment, even against the backdrop of 4 billion years of life's history, even knowing that the world has transformed beyond recognition 100 times before and will transform 100 times again, and that nothing built today is built to last forever. There is still the alligator lying in the sun at the edge of the water. There is still the bird in the tree. There is still the present moment, which is all that living things ever actually occupy. The dinosaurs are gone, and yet they are not gone. The world has changed, and yet it is made of the same matter as before, shaped by the same physical laws, occupied by the descendants of the survivors of every catastrophe the planet has ever thrown at life. The thread of continuity runs unbroken from the very first cell, 4 billion years ago, through every extinction and recovery and transformation, to the animals breathing outside your window right now. You are part of that thread, a mammal descended from the small Cretaceous insectivores that survived the KPG extinction and inherited the world, carrying in your cells, in your developmental programs, in the deep architecture of your nervous system, the legacy of every evolutionary experiment that led from the first nucleated cell to you. The dinosaur era is not separate from your story. It is part of your story. A chapter you cannot remember directly, but that shaped the conditions under which your ancestors became what they were. We are all, in the deepest sense, children of the Mesozoic, inheritors of a world shaped by creatures that are no longer here, alive because the asteroid that ended the non-avian dinosaurs did not end everything, alive because, through all the chaos and extinction and transformation, some small warm-blooded thing survived and found the world suddenly and surprisingly open to them. That is the most important mystery of all, perhaps. Not a scientific mystery exactly, but a philosophical one, a question about meaning, about what it signifies that we are here at all, that consciousness and curiosity and the ability to ask. Questions about the deep past arose in a primate species on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star, 66 million years after the most thorough catastrophe the large land animals of this world had ever encountered. We don't know, we may never fully know, but we can ask, we can wonder. We can lie here in the dark and let the vastness of the question settle over us like something warm and ancient and, in its own mysterious way, deeply comforting. The dinosaur era is over, and the age of wondering about it has only just begun. Extended meditation, the deep map of prehistoric time. We have one more thing to do tonight before we let sleep take us fully, and that is simply this: to hold the full span of what we have been exploring, not anxiously, not analytically, but in the way you might hold a landscape you are leaving, pausing at the door, looking back at the view you have lived with for a while, letting it settle into memory before you go. The Triassic world. 250 million years ago, a scorched and recovering Earth where the very first dinosaurs moved cautiously through a landscape still healing from the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. Small animals, marginal animals, animals that could not possibly have known, in whatever sense an animal can know anything, that the future belonged to them. They were small, they were cautious, they were opportunists in a world dominated by others. and something about them, some combination of physiology and luck and timing, carried them forward, the Jurassic world. 170 million years ago, a planet transformed. Pangea splitting, new oceans opening, new climates taking shape, sauropods moving through forests of Araucarian conifers, their footsteps like slow percussion. Theropods, feathered now, or at least some of them, hunting in the long Jurassic afternoon, their warm blood keeping them active while the cold-blooded animals around them slowed with the cooling evening. The sky above crossed by the first pterosaurs to achieve large body size, gliding on thermals rising from the sun-warmed canopy below. The late Cretaceous, 90 million years ago, a world full of flowers, the first real flowers, still simple by modern standards but present, speckling the edges of the great inland seas with colour that no Triassic landscape had ever worn. Hadrosaurs in enormous herds, moving through the changing vegetation, their duckbill skulls housing complex nasal passages that may have amplified their calls into something remarkable. Ceratopsians, horned and frilled and gloriously varied, the product of a million years of accelerating evolutionary experimentation. And above everything, the sky still full of pterosaurs, the last of their kind, some of them now achieving wingspans that beggar belief. And 66 million years ago, the moment before the impact, a world poised, unknowing, at the edge of its own transformation. Tyrannosaurus rex, still young as a species, only 2 or 3 million years old, newly dominant in the western interior of North America. Triceratops still occupying the same floodplains in great numbers. Small mammals still scurrying through the underbrush, still nocturnal, still tiny, still invisible against the vast backdrop of the dinosaurian world they were born into, and then the light. Not a sound at first, from the perspective of the animals on the ground. Just light, brighter than anything the world had ever produced naturally, expanding across the horizon faster than anything alive could comprehend. The beginning of a new chapter, the end of 165 million years, the moment that made the world available for us. We cannot fully understand it. We were not there. We have only the rocks, and the fossils, and the isotopes, and the mathematics, and they tell us what happened in broad strokes without capturing anything of the texture of it, of what the last day felt like for the last non-avian dinosaurs, of what the silence sounded like after. But we can imagine it, softly and gently, the way you imagine things in the passage between waking and sleep. The ancient world, vivid and real and full of creatures we will never see. The long, slow turn of the Mesozoic, each million years like a single page in a very long book. The richness and the strangeness and the unanswered questions, and the quiet understanding, settling over everything now that all of this happened, that it was real, that the fossils in museums and the sedimentary layers in cliffs around the world are not abstractions but remnants, physical traces of a world as actual and present and full of life as this one, a world that did not know it was ancient, a world that did not know it would end, a world in its own way as temporary and as magnificent as ours. Let your breathing slow now, if it has not already. Let the images soften and dissolve at the edges. The Jurassic forest, the Cretaceous, floodplain, the polar darkness at the edge of the Cretaceous world, with small-eyed dinosaurs picking their way through winter vegetation under skies that had not yet learned what the next million years would bring. Let it all become soft. Let it become something you carry gently, a sense of the world's depth and age and mystery, rather than a set of facts to be retained. The knowledge does not need to be sharp tonight. It needs only to be there, at the warm edges of awareness, a reminder that the world is very old and very full of wonder, and that you, in this moment, are alive inside it. You are here. The night is quiet. The ancient earth is somewhere beneath you. The same matter, the same atoms, the same basic physics that supported Jurassic forests and Cretaceous seas, and the slow footsteps of animals larger than anything alive today. And you are resting on it, connected to it. Part of the same story, just a different chapter. Sleep is very close now. Let it come. Let the questions dissolve into dreams. Let the great span of Mesozoic time fold itself into the soft landscape of the sleeping mind, where it will do its quiet work, consolidating and connecting and making of all these ancient images something that is, in whatever small way yours. Good night. The dinosaur era is waiting, just as it always has been, in the quiet dark of geological time, ready to be visited again whenever you need it. It will be there, enormous, patient, and full of mystery, just like the night. And so, slowly, softly, we find our way to the end of tonight's journey. You have travelled an enormous distance, in the only way that truly costs nothing, through imagination, through story, through the particular gift that language has of carrying a mind gently backward through time. You have visited worlds that no human eye has ever seen directly, worlds of Triassic deserts and Jurassic forests and Cretaceous flowering meadows, worlds populated by creatures that lived and breathed and moved through their days with the full intensity of life, and then became part of the rock, part of the story, part of what we are still, even now, in the process of understanding. The mysteries remain. The sauropods are still too large. The feathers are still older than expected. The flowering plants are still more ancient and sudden than our models easily explain. The polar dinosaurs are still impossibly hardy. The end is still partially unresolved, still layered with questions that the sedimentary record answers only in part. But that is all right. The mysteries are not frightening tonight. They are simply vast, and vastness, encountered in the right frame of mind, is a kind of rest. The mind relaxes when it meets something too large to grasp anxiously. The shoulders drop, the breathing slows. There is nothing to do with enormity except receive it. You have received it well tonight. Whatever you came to this video carrying, whatever concerns or plans or memories were active when you pressed play, they are smaller now, I hope, not gone and not dismissed, simply held in better proportion. Against the 180 million years of the dinosaur era, against the incomprehensible patience of geological time, against the miracle of a lineage of small Triassic animals that survived and diversified and ultimately produced, through a chain of lives too long to count, the animal that is now lying here, breathing slowly on the edge of sleep. The stars are out somewhere above the clouds, the same stars that shone above the Jurassic, above the Cretaceous, above the chaos of the KPG boundary. Changed in their arrangements somewhat, the galaxy turns slowly, but made of the same light, travelling the same distances, falling on a world still full of life and mystery and creatures that do not fully understand where they came from. You are one of them, and tonight, that is enough. Sleep well, dream of ancient things, and know that when you wake, the questions will still be there, patient and inexhaustible, ready to be explored again. The Mesozoic waits, as it always has, in the patient dark of deep time. Good night. Before we go, here is a question for you to leave in the comments. Which mystery of the dinosaur era fascinates you the most? Is it the giant sauropods and how they grew so enormous? The origin of birds and the mystery of the first feathers? The strange question of what the polar dinosaurs did in the months of winter darkness? Or perhaps the deepest question of all, why? After 165 million years of dominance, the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared so completely. Drop your answer below. Every response helps this channel grow, and every response is genuinely read. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Let us slow down here in this recovering world and spend a little more time among the survivors, because one of the things that often gets lost when we talk about the aftermath of the Permian extinction is how strange and lonely the world must have been. Not lonely in a sentimental sense, not in any way that the organisms living in it could have perceived, but lonely in the biological sense. A world with so few species, so few ecological relationships, so few of the layered complexity that characterizes a mature ecosystem that it would have seemed almost bare to modern eyes. Today, if you walk into a mature tropical forest, you're walking into a system of almost incomprehensible density and interconnection. Every species is linked to dozens of others through relationships of predation, competition, mutualism, parasitism, decomposition. Remove one species, and the ripples propagate outward in ways that can affect dozens of others. The system is robust because it is complex, because there are multiple pathways through which energy and nutrients can flow, multiple redundancies, multiple backup systems. The early Triassic world had none of that, or very little of it. After losing 95% of its species, the biosphere was running on a skeleton crew. The food webs were simple, the ecological relationships were few. An ecosystem that in a healthy state might have held hundreds of interlocking species was getting by, in many regions, with perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen. It was fragile in a way that the fossil record preserves, if you know how to read it. Certain early Triassic fossil sites show the same few species, over and over again, across enormous geographic distances, evidence of what paleontologists call low beta diversity, a world where the fauna looks nearly identical regardless of where you sample it. The kind of world you get when almost everything has died and a few tough generalists are spreading to fill all the available space. This ecological poverty had practical consequences for the animals living in it. For predators, it meant a limited choice of prey species. For herbivores, it meant a limited choice of plant food. For every species, it meant a community with fewer competitors, fewer parasites, fewer of the biological pressures that keep population densities in check. Early Triassic faunas are characterized in some formations by what appear to be population explosions of single species, vast numbers of a single animal type dominating an assemblage with no competitors, followed by crashes as the local ecosystem destabilized. This was not a comfortable world. It was an unstable world, a world prone to boom and bust cycles that are visible in the stratigraphy. Thick layers of a single species alternating with thin layers of barren sediment. A world where the ecological machinery was running hot and rough, not yet settled into the kind of steady-state dynamics that characterize mature, diverse ecosystems, and into this unstable, species-poor, ecologically fragile world, the dinosaurs were born. Or rather, the dinosaurs were born into this world's successor. By the time the very first dinosaurian lineages appear in the fossil record, by the time we find Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus and their contemporaries in the Ischigualasto Formation of Argentina, roughly 231 to 230 million years ago, several million years of Triassic recovery had already taken place. The world of 230 million years ago was somewhat less impoverished than the world of 250 million years ago. The ecological machinery was running more smoothly, more species had evolved, more complex food webs had assembled, but it was still a world in recovery, still a world with open niches, still a world where the rulebook of ecological dominance had not yet been settled. And it is precisely this openness, this ecological availability, that made the subsequent dinosaur radiation possible. Had dinosaurs appeared in a fully mature, highly diverse, ecologically saturated world, a world where every niche was occupied by a well-adapted specialist, and competition for resources was intense, their chances of breaking through to dominance would have been much lower. Incumbent species, already well established, have enormous advantages over newcomers in stable ecosystems. The fossil record shows this clearly. In mature, diverse faunas, new arrivals rarely displace established residents quickly. They may find marginal niches, they may persist at low abundance, but they rarely rise to dominance within just a few million years. The early to middle Triassic was not a mature, diverse, ecologically saturated world. It was still in the process of rebuilding, still filling niches, still discovering, through the patient exploration of evolutionary time, what kinds of animals could live and thrive in a world reshaped by the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. The dinosaurs arrived at exactly the right moment, and then, when the Triassic extinction of 201 million years ago cleared the field again, removing the Rhesusians, the Etosaurs, and many other established archosaur groups, the dinosaurs were positioned to take full advantage of the renewed openness. A second dose of ecological opportunity, arriving just as the first wave of dinosaurian diversification had produced a group of animals well equipped to exploit it. Luck? Certainly in part, but also the accumulated consequences of millions of years of evolution, producing animals with specific traits, high metabolic rates, efficient locomotion, flexible diets, relatively sophisticated behavior, that happened to be exactly the right toolkit for the ecological opportunities the Triassic was providing. The Triassic is a chapter about timing, about arriving at the right moment, about being, not necessarily the best, but the most available, the most prepared for the opportunities that chaos and catastrophe create. There is a philosophy here that reaches beyond paleontology, about how disruption creates possibility, about how the clearing of established systems opens space for new ones, about how what looks like catastrophe from the inside can look like opportunity from the outside. The synapsids of the Permian, the diverse, successful, dominant animals of that world, could not have survived to see the opportunity their extinction created, but their successors, the ones that made it through the bottleneck, found a world changed in ways that made room for something new. Every great transition in the history of life has this quality: the destruction that enables the creation, the clearing that precedes the flourishing, the chaos that produces in its aftermath the conditions for extraordinary diversity. The Triassic is the first, longest chapter of the age of dinosaurs, and it is a chapter about becoming, about a lineage finding its footing in a changed world, about the slow, patient, often invisible work of evolution, selecting for the traits that will matter millions of years later. The Triassic dinosaurs would not have recognized themselves in the great sauropods of the Jurassic or the tyrannosaurids of the Cretaceous. But those giants were built from the blueprints that Triassic evolution drafted. Everything that came after was already, in some sense, implicit in what came first. Within the problem of the Middle Jurassic Gap, that frustrating blank in the fossil record, there lies a concept that is less widely known but deeply important to how paleontologists think about the completeness of what we know. The concept is called a ghost lineage. A ghost lineage is, by definition, invisible. It is a period in the evolutionary history of a group during which the group must have existed, because we find its representatives at the beginning and the end of the interval, but during which we have found no fossils. The group was there. We simply have not found evidence of it. Ghost lineages are endemic to paleontology. They exist because the fossil record is by its nature fragmentary. Not all organisms, not all environments, and not all time periods leave adequate fossil documentation. The result is that the apparent origination times of many groups, the earliest known fossils, are systematically later than the actual origination times. Groups were present for significant periods before they show up in the record for the first time. How do we know this? Several ways. One is through the logic of branching relationships. If two groups diverge from a common ancestor at a particular time, and we have good fossils of one group going back further than the other, then the other group must also have been present during that earlier period. It just hasn't been found yet. This is a ghost lineage, a period of existence inferred from logic rather than from direct fossil evidence. Molecular clocks provide another line of evidence. By measuring the amount of genetic divergence between living relatives and using independently calibrated rates of molecular change, researchers can estimate when different lineages diverged from each other. These estimates often suggest much earlier origination times than the fossil record alone would indicate. Mammals, for example, have a fossil record going back to the late Triassic, roughly 220 million years ago. But molecular clock estimates suggest the major mammalian lineages diverged much earlier, perhaps in the Middle Triassic or even earlier. The implication is that those early lineages existed for tens of millions of years before leaving the fossils we have found. In the context of the Middle Jurassic, ghost lineages are especially important because the groups that dominate the late Jurassic, the neosauropods, the tetaneuron, theropods, the ornithischian lineages, must have been present and diversifying during the Middle Jurassic, even though we have relatively few fossils documenting their existence at that time. The late Jurassic world we know so well from places like the Morrison Formation did not appear suddenly and fully formed out of nothing. It was the product of Middle Jurassic evolution happening in environments and geographic regions that have not yet yielded good fossil documentation. This means that our picture of dinosaur evolution during the Middle Jurassic is not merely incomplete. It is systematically biased. We are missing, almost certainly, many lineages that were present, many ecological experiments that were taking place, many of the transitional forms that bridge the gap between the relatively modest early Jurassic dinosaur fauna and the spectacular late Jurassic fauna we know so well. The ghost lineages of the Middle Jurassic are filled with animals that we may simply never find, and yet paleontologists continue to try. The last decade has seen extraordinary fossil discoveries from Middle Jurassic deposits in China, in Scotland, in Tanzania, and elsewhere that have significantly enriched our understanding of this period. Each new specimen is a small illumination in a largely dark room, not sufficient to light the room fully, but enough to reveal, in flashes, some of what was hiding in the shadows. Among the most exciting recent discoveries from the Middle Jurassic are specimens of early branching members of the major theropod lineages, animals that are, in terms of their anatomy, nearly halfway between the primitive early Jurassic theropods and the advanced Cretaceous forms that are so familiar. These transitional animals give us glimpses of the Middle Jurassic evolutionary experiments, the trials and errors, the false starts and the successful innovations that led to the extraordinary diversity of the late Jurassic and Cretaceous. One particularly interesting class of discovery involves the early evolution of Maniraptor and theropods, the group that includes birds, dromaeosaurids, troodontids, and oviraptorosaurs, among others. Maniraptorans are characterized by a suite of features: relatively large brains, complex feathering, long arms with grasping hands, highly pneumatized skeletons that make them the most bird-like of the non-avian dinosaurs. And the evidence suggests that these features were assembling themselves during the Middle Jurassic in lineages that we are only beginning to recover from the fossil record. The picture that emerges is of a Middle Jurassic world that was, in many ways, a laboratory. A place where the fundamental innovations that would define the late Cretaceous dinosaur fauna, the anatomical features, the physiological sophistication, the behavioral complexity, were being assembled, piecemeal, in lineages that we cannot fully see, a world of ghost lineages and invisible transitions, of evolutionary experiments whose outcomes we know but whose processes remain obscure. This is the Middle Jurassic gap in all its frustrating, fascinating depth. Not just a missing chapter in the book of life, but a missing chapter in a book that we know, from what comes before and after, must have contained some of the most important content. A chapter we are still, painstakingly, trying to reconstruct from the fragments that time has not yet fully erased. Perhaps the most biomechanically remarkable feature of any dinosaur, perhaps of any animal in the history of land vertebrates, is the neck of the large sauropods. Not just its length, though that is remarkable enough. The neck of Supersaurus has been estimated at up to 15 meters, longer than most entire dinosaurs, but the length is only part of the problem. The deeper issue is how it functioned. A 15-meter neck is not simply a 10-meter neck scaled up by 50%. The physics change non-linearly. A longer neck is heavier, but it is heavier by more than the linear relationship between length and weight would suggest, because the muscle mass needed to support and control the neck also increases with length. The leverage disadvantage of moving a very long lever arm from a fixed pivot point near the shoulders means that the muscles needed to raise and lower the neck have to exert forces that are, biomechanically, extreme, and yet the fossil evidence is clear. Sauropods existed. Their necks were exactly as long as the fossils indicate, and those necks were not, for the most part, held in the drooping, gravity-defeated posture that early reconstruction sometimes showed. Evidence from preserved cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck, and from comparisons with the neck anatomy of living archosaurs suggests that sauropod necks were held with a natural resting curvature that kept the head elevated above the level of the shoulders in most species. One of the key innovations that made this possible was the extraordinary pneumatization of the cervical vertebrae. In some sauropod species, particularly the titanosaurs and diplodocids, the neck vertebrae were so thoroughly hollowed by air spaces that they were, in cross-section, mostly empty. The bone was present only as thin struts and shells enclosing a network of air-filled chambers, the whole structure resembling an architectural foam more than solid bone. The result was a neck that was lighter than any comparable structure in a mammal or modern reptile could possibly be, light enough that the muscles, even though they were working at a significant mechanical disadvantage, could support and move it. But there is a further complication. For most of the history of sauropod biomechanics research, the default assumption was that sauropod necks worked on roughly the same principles as the necks of living large tetrapods. That is, they were controlled primarily by ligaments and muscles running along the neck, with the vertebrae stacked in a column and the muscles doing the work of adjustment and support. This model produces, for the longer sauropod necks, muscle cross-sections and leverage requirements that appear, by the calculations, to be close to or beyond the physiological limits of biological tissue. Recent work has suggested a possible solution, that sauropod necks may have been partially supported by a hydraulic or pneumatic system, the air sacs of the respiratory system, distributed throughout the neck, providing a pressurized structural support that reduced the load on the muscles. This is a genuinely novel hypothesis, and it is supported by some analogies with the pneumatic support systems of modern bird spines. But it is also controversial and not yet widely accepted. What is accepted, broadly, is that sauropod neck mechanics involved a combination of innovations: skeletal lightening, pneumatic support, unusual muscle and ligament arrangements, possibly behavioral strategies like counterbalancing the neck with the tail, that together solved the engineering problem of the long neck in ways we are still in detail working out. The debate over how sauropod necks functioned is itself a window into one of the most fundamental questions in biology, the question of constraint. Every body plan has constraints, physical, developmental, physiological limits on what it can do. Evolution cannot build anything it wants. It can only modify what already exists, and the modifications have to be viable at every intermediate step. A sauropod could not suddenly have grown a 20-meter neck from a 1-meter neck in a single generation. The intermediate forms, the animals with necks of 4 meters, then 6, then 9, then 12, had to each be viable, functional, able to feed and move and reproduce. That each of these intermediate forms was viable tells us something important, that the neck was useful at every stage of its elongation, not just at the extreme end. This fits with the general picture of neck elongation in sauropods as a dietary adaptation, getting access to food resources at heights or distances unavailable to competing herbivores at every stage of the neck's progressive lengthening, each additional meter providing an additional increment of competitive advantage. But the specific way in which the engineering problems of neck support and control were solved at each stage remains partially obscure. The fossil record shows us the endpoints of the trajectory much better than it shows us the intermediate steps, because intermediate stages tend to be less common in fossil assemblages than the derived forms that came to dominate their ecosystems. We see the fully formed, functionally extreme long-necked sauropod in abundance. We see the modest-necked early sauropodomorphs at the beginning, and in between, we have a patchwork of specimens that hints at the trajectory without fully documenting it. The neck of Mamenchisaurus, a late Jurassic sauropod from China with a neck that may have reached 9 to 11 meters, comprising nearly half the animal's total body length, was, for a long time, the longest neck known in any animal that has ever lived. More recent discoveries have added competitors for that title, but Mamenchisaurus remains a good example of what sauropod neck elongation could achieve in a lineage that pushed the adaptation to unusual extremes within its own particular phylogenetic context. The anatomy of the Mamenchisaurus neck shows some of the features we would expect from extreme elongation, heavily pneumatized vertebrae, remarkably long processes that may have anchored powerful ligaments running the length of the neck, and a small head with simplified peg-like teeth at the end. A head that had to be light enough for those biomechanical innovations to keep it elevated. Everything in the design converges on the single overriding requirement: keep the head attached and functional at the end of that extraordinary lever arm. When we look at the neck of Mamenchisaurus or Diplodocus, or any of the other extreme-necked sauropods, we are looking at one of the most exquisite examples of evolutionary problem-solving in the history of life. A set of engineering challenges solved, incompletely and imperfectly in the eyes of a human engineer, but with enormous practical effectiveness, over the course of tens of millions of years of gradual modification. A structure that, by every reasonable calculation, should not quite work, and yet clearly did, because the animals bearing it survived and reproduced and dominated their ecosystems for millions of years. The flowering plant revolution did not happen in isolation. It happened in the context of, and in deep partnership with, the diversification of a group of animals that are, by almost any measure, the most successful animals on Earth, the insects. Insects had been present since the Devonian, so over 350 million years ago, and had already achieved extraordinary diversity long before the first dinosaur hatched from its egg. The Carboniferous forests were patrolled by dragonflies with wingspans approaching 70 centimeters. The Permian fauna included beetles, true bugs, grasshopper relatives, and many other recognizably modern insect orders. The Triassic recovery after the Great Dying saw insects like dinosaurs expand into empty niches with impressive speed. But it was the Cretaceous, and specifically the flowering plant revolution, that truly set insect evolution into overdrive. The key is the coevolutionary relationship. Flowers evolved to attract pollinators. Pollinators evolved to exploit flowers. Each step forward in flower complexity and diversity created new opportunities for pollinator specialization. Each step forward in pollinator capability created new opportunities for flower diversity. The two groups pulled each other forward in an evolutionary arms race that, unlike most evolutionary arms races, was net positive for both sides, a race in which winning meant both parties getting better at what they did, rather than one side being eliminated. The results were, and are, spectacular. Modern Hymenoptera, bees, wasps, and their relatives, comprise more than 100,000 described species, most of them associated in some way with flowering plant ecology. Modern beetles, which had already diversified extensively in the Triassic and Jurassic, added many new lineages in the Cretaceous associated specifically with angiosperm-derived resources, the resins of angiosperm trees, the pollen stored in angiosperm flowers, the dead wood of angiosperm forests. Modern Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, appear in the fossil record in close correlation with the angiosperm radiation, the larval stages of most species being highly specific to particular plant families or genera. The insect fossils preserved in Cretaceous amber, hardened, tree resin that has captured insects in extraordinary three-dimensional detail, give us our best window into the insect world of this period. Burmese amber from Myanmar, dated to approximately 99 million years ago, is among the richest sources of Cretaceous insect fossils in the world. From this material, researchers have described thousands of insect species, including many that are assignable to modern families, and reveal, in intimate detail, the state of insect evolution at the midpoint of the Cretaceous. Some of the amber fossils are extraordinary in what they preserve. Pieces of amber have been found containing insects in the act of visiting flowers, a direct fossilized record of the pollination behavior that was driving the coevolution of insects and angiosperms. Others preserve insects in the act of mating, in group behaviors, in stages of metamorphosis. All the complex biology of insect lives, captured in moments of amber transparency that the insects themselves could not have anticipated. And then there are the stranger finds. Amber from the Cretaceous has preserved parasitic insects whose biology raises questions about the ecosystems they inhabited. It has preserved the larvae of species whose adult forms we have not found. It has preserved insects associated with vertebrate animals in ways that reveal aspects of the parasitology and ecology of the Cretaceous world that no other evidence source could provide. Among the most remarkable of these finds, amber has preserved feathers and hair embedded in tree resin alongside insects, giving us snapshots of the interface between the vertebrate fauna and the insect fauna that ordinarily leaves no fossil trace, and in a few extraordinary cases amber has preserved the remains of small vertebrates themselves, lizard limbs, snake scales, frog legs, bird feathers, even the tail of a small non-avian dinosaur, all caught in resin and preserved for 99 million years in the translucent amber equivalent of a photograph. The insect world of the Cretaceous was rich beyond our ability to fully reconstruct even from this extraordinary material. Three-dimensional, dynamic, full of behaviors and relationships and ecological dependencies that we can only partially glimpse. But what we can see is enough to appreciate the scale of the transformation that the flowering plant revolution triggered, not just in the plants themselves, not just in the large animals that ate the plants, but in the incomprehensibly diverse microscopic world of the insects, where the real story of Cretaceous ecology was largely being written. The polar dinosaurs we discussed earlier, the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians and smaller ornithopods that lived at high latitudes year-round, raise questions not just about physiology and survival, but about behavior. Because behavior is, in many ways, the most powerful tool that any animal has for dealing with environmental challenge, and the behavioral toolkit available to large-brained, socially complex dinosaurs was potentially quite rich. We cannot, of course, observe dinosaur behavior directly. The fossil record preserves anatomy, and it occasionally preserves behavioral traces in the form of footprints, nesting sites, bone beds, and bite marks. But the reconstruction of behavior from these sources is always inferential, a matter of reasoning carefully from evidence that was not designed to tell us about behavior. With that caveat in mind, let us think about what the polar dinosaurs might have done. The hadrosaurs of the North Slope belong to the genus Edmontosaurus, or a closely related form recently named Ugronala cookpacensis, which means ancient grazer of the Colville River, in the Inupiaq language of the region's indigenous people. They were large, adults reaching perhaps 8 to 9 meters in length and weighing several tons, and they appear, from bone histology evidence, to have grown rapidly, reaching near adult size within a few years of hatching. The rapid growth rate is itself a behavioral or at least physiological clue. Animals that grow rapidly are generally investing heavily in reaching adult size, and adult size matters for thermoregulation. A larger animal has a smaller surface area to volume ratio than a smaller one, which means it loses heat more slowly per unit of body mass. For animals dealing with polar winters, large body size is a thermal asset, and the selection pressure for rapid growth to large size would have been intense. The hadrosaurs also possessed elaborate nasal crests in some species, hollow, bony structures that connected to the nasal passages and may have served as resonating chambers for vocalizations. Modern birds, the living relatives of dinosaurs, use vocalizations extensively for social communication, mate attraction, territory defense, flock coordination, predator warning. If hadrosaurs were using their crests for similar purposes, and the anatomy strongly suggests they were capable of producing a range of sounds, then the polar hadrosaur herds may have been acoustically complex social groups, maintaining cohesion and coordination through a repertoire of calls that echoed across the polar landscape. This matters for survival at high latitudes. Staying together in a herd provides multiple advantages: more eyes watching for predators, more bodies generating collective heat in cold conditions, more individuals available for the mutual grooming and social bonding behaviors that help large social animals maintain group cohesion across the stresses of a challenging environment. Many modern large mammals that live in cold climates are highly gregarious for exactly these reasons. The suggestion that polar hadrosaurs were similarly gregarious is not unreasonable. The nesting behavior of polar dinosaurs is another point of active inquiry. If Edmontosaurus and its relatives were indeed breeding at polar latitudes, and the presence of juveniles in North Slope sediments strongly suggests they were, then the nesting behavior had to be adapted to the polar environment in some way. Modern sea turtles, geese, and many other animals undertake long migrations to reach specific breeding sites. But the juveniles at the North Slope are too young to have migrated long distances. They were born there or very close to it. This means that the nesting sites were at or near the North Slope, and nesting at 80 degrees north, even in the warmer world of the Cretaceous, required some specific adaptations. Modern birds in similar latitudes time their breeding very precisely to take advantage of the long summer days, nesting and raising chicks in the brief window of summer abundance before the approach of winter forces them to move south. The polar hadrosaurs may have followed a similar strategy, nesting in late spring, growing their young through the long summer days when vegetation was plentiful and daylight was near continuous, and then either moving south or, if the physiological evidence for year-round residency is correct, surviving the winter by some combination of behavioral and physiological strategy. The picture that emerges from all of this speculative but evidence-grounded reasoning is of a polar dinosaur fauna that was not simply enduring its environment, but actively adapted to exploit it. Large body size for thermal stability, rapid growth to reach adult size quickly, social complexity for mutual benefit, behavioral flexibility for seasonal resource management. These are not the features of animals barely hanging on at the edge of habitability. These are the features of animals that had made the polar world their own. And this, in turn, tells us something important about the adaptive flexibility of the dinosaurian lineage as a whole. The same basic body plan and physiological framework that produced the enormous sauropods of equatorial Jurassic forests also produced the cold-adapted polar hadrosaurs of the late Cretaceous. The same lineage that evolved forms capable of living in tropical environments also evolved forms capable of surviving polar darkness. This range, this ecological breadth, is one of the most impressive features of dinosaur biology, and it is one that is still not fully appreciated outside the specialist literature. Let us add a few more names to the list of inexplicable dinosaurs, because the list is long and the creatures on it deserve more than a brief mention. Carnotaurus sastre was a large theropod from Argentina, living in the late Cretaceous approximately 69 to 71 million years ago. Its anatomy is, in several respects, baffling. The skull is remarkably short and deep for a large theropod, almost blunt, with a profile more like a bulldog than like the elongated skulls of most comparable predators. Above the eyes, two prominent horns projected from the skull roof are the only known example of horns in any large theropod dinosaur. The forelimbs were extraordinarily reduced, even more so than in Tyrannosaurus rex, short, stubby, apparently nearly functionless appendages attached to a body designed for cursory speed and impact. Skin impressions associated with Carnotaurus specimens reveal a scaling pattern unlike that of any other large dinosaur known, rows of large, conical, boss-like scales set in a matrix of smaller, granular scales, creating a texture more like some modern monitor lizards than like the smoother scaling of most reconstructed large theropods. These impressions are among the most extensive and detailed large theropod skin impressions ever found, and they raise questions about thermoregulation and display that remain unanswered. What did Carnotaurus do with those horns? Horn structures in living animals serve multiple functions: intraspecific combat, species recognition, display, possibly predator deterrence. The horns of Carnotaurus are too small to have been effective weapons in combat with prey, but they may have been significant in combat with rivals of the same species. The short, deep skull, which generates a different bite force profile than the longer skulls of most comparable predators, may have been associated with a different prey-killing technique, perhaps a powerful, rapid ramming or crushing blow rather than the sustained bite-and-hold technique of most large theropods. The details remain speculative. And then there is the deeply strange case of Styracosaurus, a ceratopsian with not one, not two, but many prominent horns and frill spikes in configurations that seem almost comically elaborate by any standard of functional anatomy. The large nasal horn, the eyebrow horns, and the multiple spikes projecting from the frill create a skull whose full anatomical function is, despite extensive research, still not fully mapped. The diversity of frill and horn configurations across ceratopsian species suggests that display and species recognition were major drivers of these structures. But the specific selection pressures that produced the particular geometry of any given species' elaborate head ornamentation remain to be fully explained. Then there is the case of Oviraptor, literally egg thief, named in the belief that a specimen found associated with a nest was stealing the eggs it was found with. Decades later, further research established that the eggs were Oviraptor's own. It was brooding them, not stealing them. The name stuck, but the animal's reputation was rehabilitated. Modern reconstructions, influenced by the discovery of closely related forms with extensive feathering, depict Oviraptor as a feathered, beaked omnivorous biped with a pronounced crest on its skull and a probable lifestyle involving complex social behavior and active parental care. But the details of what Oviraptor ate, the function of that deep, powerful, toothless beak, remain debated. Eggs? Mollusks? Hard plant material like seeds or nuts? Tough vegetation? The beak appears designed for crushing or processing something hard, but what exactly that something was is not definitively established. An animal so distinctive in its anatomy should be easy to interpret, and yet the details of its ecology remain elusive. These animals, Carnotaurus, Styracosaurus, Oviraptor, and dozens of others that exhibit anatomical features whose functions remain partially or fully uncertain, are reminders of how much we still do not understand about the day-to-day lives of even the most extensively studied dinosaurs. We have their bones. We have, in some cases, their skin. We have their footprints and their eggs. And yet what they did with those bodies, hour by hour, across the span of their lives, remains largely invisible to us. The Chicxulub impact, named for the town near the center of the crater on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, was not at first understood to be what it was. The crater itself was hidden, buried under kilometers of sediment deposited in the 66 million years since the impact, partially submerged under the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, not visible at the surface in any way that 19th or early 20th century geologists could have recognized. It was only through the combination of oil company drilling data, which revealed a buried circular structure of unusual geology beneath the Yucatan, and the independent discovery of the iridium-enriched KP boundary layer by Luis and Walter Alvarez in 1980, that the Chicxulub crater was eventually recognized for what it was. The Alvarez discovery was itself extraordinary. Analyzing a thin layer of clay deposited exactly at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the geological boundary between the last Cretaceous sediments and the first Paleogene sediments. In a cliff in Gubbio, Italy, Luis Alvarez and his son Walter found an anomalous concentration of iridium, a metal that is extremely rare in the Earth's crust but relatively abundant in some types of meteorite. The iridium layer was too thick and too globally consistent to be explained by normal geological processes. It had to have come from somewhere else. The hypothesis the Alvarezes proposed was radical. A large asteroid had struck the Earth at the KPG boundary, vaporizing itself and distributing its material globally, in a layer of dust that settled over the entire planet. The mass extinction at the boundary was caused by the environmental consequences of this impact. The impact winter, produced by the cloud of dust and aerosols blocking sunlight, the disruption of photosynthesis, and the resulting collapse of food chains. The hypothesis was controversial when proposed in 1980. The geological and paleontological communities were, at that time, largely committed to a view of gradualism, the idea that change in the geological record happened slowly over millions of years, driven by slow-acting processes rather than by catastrophic events. The idea that a mass extinction had been caused by a single event on a single afternoon seemed, to many researchers, too sudden, too dramatic, too out of keeping with the slow rhythms that geology had taught them to expect. The subsequent decades have vindicated the Alvarezes comprehensively. The iridium layer has been found at KPG boundary sites on every continent and in ocean sediments around the world, exactly as the impact hypothesis predicted. The Chicxulub crater was identified and dated to exactly the KPG boundary. The shocked quartz and glass spherules that indicate extreme impact events have been found distributed globally at the boundary level. The case for an asteroid impact as the primary cause of the KPG mass extinction is, at this point, essentially beyond dispute. But the precise mechanism of the extinction, how an asteroid impact translated into the death of every non-avian dinosaur and 75% of all species on Earth, is still being refined. The initial hypothesis focused on impact winter, the global cloud of dust and aerosols reducing sunlight, cooling temperatures, disrupting photosynthesis. This mechanism is well supported and was certainly a major contributor to the extinction. More recent research has added complexity. The target rocks at Chicxulub, the seafloor sediments that the asteroid struck, were unusually rich in sulfur-containing minerals. When these were vaporized by the impact, they produced enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide, which combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These aerosols were highly effective at scattering sunlight, amplifying and prolonging the impact winter effect far beyond what dust alone would have produced. The fires are another element. The energy pulse from the impact, the blast wave, the infrared radiation from ejected material re-entering the atmosphere, ignited wildfires across enormous areas of multiple continents. The soot from these fires added to the atmospheric opacity and contributed to the photosynthetic shutdown. The ocean is a story unto itself. The Chicxulub impact struck a shallow sea, vaporizing enormous quantities of seawater and injecting it directly into the upper atmosphere, compounding the acid rain problem. The impact generated mega tsunami, waves of extraordinary height that propagated outward from the impact site and devastated coastal ecosystems around the Gulf of Mexico and beyond, and the chemical changes to ocean chemistry triggered by the atmospheric injection of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds drove rapid acidification and deoxygenation of surface waters, killing the phytoplankton that form the base of the marine food web. The extinction was, in other words, multi-mechanistic. It was not a single killing blow, but a cascade of interlocking crises, each amplifying and compounding the others, applied simultaneously to every ecosystem on Earth. No group of organisms was untouched. The selectivity of survival, why birds made it and non-avian dinosaurs did not, why mammals made it and many other vertebrates did not, reflects a complex interaction between the specific mechanisms of the extinction and the specific biological characteristics of different groups. We understand the broad outlines of this interaction. We understand that small body size helped by reducing food requirements and allowing survival on seeds and cached resources through the post-impact famine. We understand that dietary flexibility helped by allowing survivors to exploit whatever resources became available as the crisis continued. We understand that certain habitats, freshwater systems for example, which were buffered from some of the ocean acidification effects, may have provided refugia for survivors. But the details of who survived and who did not, across the full diversity of late Cretaceous life, are still being worked out. The KPG extinction is the best studied mass extinction in Earth's history, and yet it remains, in many of its specifics, incompletely understood. New fossil sites from the earliest Paleogene, the period immediately following the extinction, are revealing the identities of the survivors and the speed of the recovery in ways that will, over the coming decades, substantially enrich our understanding. The story of the KPG extinction is, ultimately, a story about contingency, about how the history of life, for all its complexity and pattern, is also shot through with the random. An asteroid that was slightly smaller, or that struck a different kind of rock, or that arrived 10 million years earlier or later. Any of these alternatives might have produced a different outcome, different survivors, a different world. Perhaps no mammals large enough to compete with the new dinosaurian immigrants from whatever habitat they came from. Perhaps no primates. Perhaps no humans. We are here in part because of an astronomical coincidence, the particular trajectory of a particular rock in space, the particular moment at which it arrived, the particular chemistry of the rock it struck. The contingency of our existence is one of the most humbling thoughts that the study of deep time offers. Not frightening, simply humbling. A reminder that the present is not inevitable, that the world could have been different, that we are, in the most fundamental sense, the beneficiaries of a chain of chance events reaching back across 4.5 billion years of planetary history. That chain includes an asteroid. It includes the Permian extinction. It includes the small Triassic animals from which the dinosaurs descended. It includes every mass extinction and recovery and diversification event in the long story of life on Earth. And it includes, at the end of it all, the improbable fact of consciousness, of awareness, of a species capable of looking back at the chain and wondering about it. We are the universe asking itself questions about its own history, and the history, for all its mystery and incompleteness, is extraordinary. Let us extend our inventory of open questions to include some of the most exciting frontiers in current dinosaur science, the areas where new techniques and new discoveries are producing results that would have seemed like science fiction just a generation ago. The analysis of ancient proteins preserved in dinosaur bone is perhaps the most surprising of these frontiers. For decades, the conventional wisdom held that biological molecules, DNA, proteins, the organic compounds that make up living tissue, could not survive in fossils older than a few million years at most. The chemical processes of decomposition and fossilization were believed to destroy all organic material, leaving behind only the mineralized replacement of the original bone. Then, in 2005, Mary Schweitzer and colleagues at North Carolina State University reported the discovery of soft tissue, flexible, blood vessel-like structures, and apparently cellular material, recovered from the interior of a Tyrannosaurus rex femur approximately 68 million years old. The discovery was met with widespread skepticism. It seemed to violate basic biochemistry. Organic materials simply could not survive that long, but subsequent work has substantially validated the finding. Similar structures have been recovered from multiple dinosaur specimens from different time periods and different geographic locations. The material has been analysed using multiple independent techniques, including mass spectrometry, and appears to preserve fragments of genuine biological proteins. Collagen, in particular, the structural protein that makes up much of the matrix of bone. The implications are significant. If collagen fragments can survive in dinosaur bone for 68 million years, then the biochemistry of the fossilization process, the way in which bone minerals and organic material interact over millions of years, is more complex than previously thought. And the possibility that other biological information might also survive, perhaps not intact DNA, but protein sequences long enough to contain useful phylogenetic information, opens extraordinary new avenues for research. Protein sequencing, in particular, offers a path toward molecular phylogenetics of deep time that was previously thought impossible. DNA degrades much faster than protein. The chances of recovering readable DNA from a non-avian dinosaur are essentially zero with current techniques. But protein sequences, read from mass spectrometric analysis of ancient bone, may be extractable from specimens much older than any preserved DNA, and they can provide information about evolutionary relationships and physiological characteristics that was previously available only through comparative anatomy. Another frontier involves the detailed scanning and modelling of dinosaur skulls and brains. Modern CT scanning techniques allow researchers to image the internal structure of fossilized skulls without destroying them, revealing the shape of the brain endocast, the impression left in the skull by the brain that inhabited it, with a precision that would have required damaging specimens in earlier eras. From these endocasts, researchers can reconstruct the relative sizes of different brain regions and compare them with the brains of living relatives. These comparisons reveal, in broad strokes, the neurological sophistication of different dinosaur groups. The large relative size of the cerebrum and the olfactory lobes in some theropods suggest sensory and cognitive capabilities, more like those of modern birds than like those of modern reptiles. The large optic lobes in some species suggest acute vision as an important sensory modality. The vestibular systems of the inner ear, also reconstructable from CT data, reveal details about balance and head movement that can tell us about posture and locomotion. These tools are still relatively new, and their application to the full breadth of the dinosaur and family tree is still in progress. But the picture emerging from their use is of a group of animals with far greater sensory and cognitive complexity than the glorified lizard stereotype would suggest. Dinosaurs, at least in the more derived theropod lineages, were by the neurological evidence genuinely sophisticated animals, capable of complex behavior, sensitive to multiple sensory channels simultaneously, perhaps capable of learning and social cognition in ways that we have barely begun to explore. There is also the frontier of dinosaur colour, which we touched on earlier but deserves more attention. The discovery that melanosomes, tiny nanoscale structures within cells that determine the colour of feathers and skin, can be preserved in fossil feathers has opened the possibility of reconstructing the colour of feathered dinosaurs from direct physical evidence rather than speculation. The technique involves comparing the shape and arrangement of fossilized melanosomes with the shape and arrangement of melanosomes in feathers of known colour from modern birds. Different melanosome shapes, cylindrical, oblate, spherical, elongated, produce different colours in modern bird feathers, and these shapes are preserved in extraordinary detail in some fossil feathers. The matching is not always straightforward, but in favourable specimens it has been possible to reconstruct specific colour patterns with reasonable confidence. The results, where they have been achieved, are striking. Anchiornis was black and white with rust-red patches. Sinosauropteryx was reddish-brown with darker stripes. Microraptor's feathers appear to have been iridescent black. These are not grey, drab animals. They are animals with specific, complex, presumably communicatively, significant colour patterns, animals that presumably saw each other clearly, and that responded to what they saw in ways we can only partially imagine. The frontier of melanosome-based colour reconstruction is expanding as the technique is refined and applied to more specimens. Future work will almost certainly extend our colour knowledge to more species and may eventually reach into skin impressions from non-feathered dinosaurs as well, though the preservation challenges are greater there. And then there is the frontier of dinosaur diseases and injuries, reconstructible from detailed examination of fossil bone, healed fractures, evidence of infection, signs of arthritis, marks of parasitic infestation. All of these have been documented in dinosaur specimens, giving us direct evidence of the biological challenges that individual animals faced and survived. In some cases, the evidence of disease or injury is so specific that it has enabled comparisons with equivalent conditions. In modern animals, illuminating aspects of dinosaur physiology that are not visible in healthy specimens. A well-documented example is a specimen of Tyrannosaurus rex that shows signs consistent with trichomoniasis, a parasitic infection caused by protozoan parasites in the genus Trichomonas that, in modern birds, produces distinctive lesions on the mouth and esophagus, eventually leading to starvation. The pattern of bone damage in the T-Rex jaw matches what would be expected from this kind of infection. If confirmed, this is a direct window into the parasitology of the dinosaur world, evidence that the same kinds of microscopic enemies that afflict modern birds were already present and active in the Cretaceous ecosystem. These frontiers, ancient proteins, brain morphology, colour reconstruction, paleopathology, are just a few of the areas where current dinosaur science is producing results that reframe our understanding of what these animals were. Each new technique opens a new window. Each new discovery raises new questions. The field is, in the early 21st century, more active and more productive than at any previous point in its history. The dinosaur era is not a closed book. It is a book that is still being read, more carefully, with better tools by more researchers, with more sophisticated questions than ever before. And what they are finding, page by patient page, is a world more complex, more nuanced, more biologically extraordinary than the one we grew up imagining. We have spent most of our journey on land, following the footprints of the dinosaurs across the changing landscapes of the Mesozoic. But the dinosaur era was not only a story of the land. The seas that surrounded and divided the ancient continents were, during those 180 million years, the setting for their own extraordinary drama. A drama full of creatures so remarkable and so poorly understood that they deserve a chapter of their own. The Mesozoic, oceans were not the oceans we know today. Not because they were made of different water, the water has been cycling through the same planetary system for billions of years, but because they were inhabited by a completely different cast of creatures. Today, the top predators of the ocean are sharks, orcas, and great white sharks. During the Mesozoic, the top predators were reptiles. Not fish, not mammals. Reptiles. The ichthyosaurs arrived earliest in the story. They appeared in the early Triassic within just a few million years of the Permian extinction, and they evolved with extraordinary speed into forms that were, in their outward appearance, almost indistinguishable from modern dolphins or large tuna. This is a classic example of convergent evolution, the phenomenon whereby distantly related organisms independently evolve similar body plans in response to similar ecological pressures. The physics of efficient movement through water constrain the available solutions, and so a streamlined, spindle-shaped body with a vertical tail fin and paired flippers was independently evolved by at least three major groups: dolphins and their relatives, mammals, ichthyosaurs, reptiles, and some modern fish. The convergence between dolphins and ichthyosaurs is, in some cases, striking enough to be almost eerie. Both groups evolved approximately the same body proportions, the same arrangement of flippers, the same general skull shape with elongated snouts full of conical teeth for catching fish. Both groups appear to have been warm-blooded, capable of maintaining elevated body temperatures that allowed sustained active swimming. Both groups evolved live birth, avoiding the problem of egg-laying, which requires dry land or at least shallow water, by giving birth to live young directly in the open ocean. Both groups were social, apparently living in groups and engaging in complex intraspecific interactions. But ichthyosaurs were not dolphins, they were reptiles that had evolved from a terrestrial or semi-aquatic ancestor into fully marine animals over the course of perhaps 10 to 20 million years. The earliest ichthyosaurs, from the early Triassic, show clearly reptilian features, limbs that are transitional between walking limbs and fins, body shapes that are not yet fully streamlined. By the middle Triassic, they had already achieved the dolphin-like body plan in most of its essentials. By the early Jurassic, they had diversified into dozens of species ranging from small, slender fish catchers to massive predators approaching 20 meters in length, among the largest animals ever to have existed in the oceans, and then, in the late Cretaceous, they disappeared. Not in the KPG extinction, they were gone long before that. The last ichthyosaurs vanished from the fossil record around 90 million years ago, nearly 25 million years before the asteroid. Why? The answer, here as so often in paleontology, is not fully certain. The Cenomanian-Turonian oceanic anoxic event, a global episode of oceanic deoxygenation approximately 94 million years ago, triggered by massive volcanism, disrupted marine food webs on a global scale, reducing prey availability for large predators. The simultaneous radiation of more advanced fish, the teleosts, which include most of the bony fish alive today, may have intensified competition for food resources. And the diversification of the mosasaurs, large, highly effective marine lizards that appeared in the late Cretaceous and rapidly became the dominant large marine predators of the latest Mesozoic, may have contributed to the competitive exclusion of the last ichthyosaur lineages, but the specific sequence of these factors and their relative importance is not fully established. Ichthyosaurs were one of the most successful marine vertebrate groups in Earth's history, persisting in diverse and abundant forms for over 160 million years. Their final disappearance, decades before the KPG event, is one of the more puzzling extinction events in the Mesozoic record. The plesiosaurs are another great Mesozoic marine group, and they present their own set of mysteries. Plesiosaurs appeared in the late Triassic and diversified into two broad body plan types that were maintained throughout the group's 135 million year history. The long-necked plesiosaurs proper, with small heads and enormously extended necks supported by dozens of vertebrae, and the pliosaurs, with short, massive necks, enormous heads, and powerful jaws capable of generating bite forces that were, in the larger species, among the highest of any known animal. The long-necked plesiosaurs have a famous relationship with popular culture. The Loch Ness Monster legend is, at least in part inspired by the image of a long-necked plesiosaur surviving into the modern era. But the reality of their biology is more interesting than any legend. Those long necks, up to 7 meters in some species, were supported by an unusual arrangement of ribs and muscles quite different from anything in modern reptiles. How these necks moved in life, and what ecological function the extreme elongation served, is a genuine question. One hypothesis suggests that the long neck functioned as a kind of ambush weapon in open water environments, the plesiosaur's body approaching a school of fish from below, then the neck shooting forward to strike before the fish could escape. The neck on this view was a speed advantage, longer than the combined escape speed of the fish. Another hypothesis suggests that the long neck allowed feeding in ways that the short-necked forms could not, reaching into rocky crevices or seabed vegetation, possibly feeding in shallow coastal habitats, where the compact body could remain in deeper water while the neck extended shoreward. The feeding behaviour of long-necked plesiosaurs is bluntly still not well understood. Stomach contents preserved in a small number of fossil specimens give some clues: fish, small cephalopods, and in one case apparently a small flying reptile. But the full diet and feeding strategy of long-necked plesiosaurs across their long history remains largely inferred rather than directly evidenced. The plesiosaurs, by contrast, have a feeding strategy that seems more straightforward: large heads, powerful jaws, strong flippers for powerful burst swimming. These are the features of an active pursuit predator capable of tackling large prey. The largest plesiosaurs, including Kronosaurus and the enormous Predator X, now named Plesiosaurus funki, may have exceeded 12 meters in length and had skulls approaching 2 meters in jaw length, with conical interlocking teeth capable of biting through most contemporary marine organisms. But even here, the details are uncertain. The locomotion of plesiosaurs, specifically whether they used a combined rowing and flying technique with all 4 flippers, or whether they relied primarily on the hind flippers for propulsion and used the 4 flippers primarily for steering, has been debated. Modern computational fluid dynamics modelling of pliosaur flipper geometry suggests the former, a swimming style somewhat analogous to that of sea turtles, generating propulsion from all 4 limbs in a coordinated gait. But the details of this reconstruction depend on assumptions about limb flexibility and muscle arrangement that cannot be directly verified from fossil material. And then there are the mosasaurs, the late Cretaceous marine lizards that filled the predator niche after the ichthyosaurs declined. Mosasaurs were not archosaurs, they were squamates, closely related to modern monitor lizards and, more surprisingly, to modern snakes. They appeared in the late Cretaceous, approximately 98 million years ago, as relatively modest-sized marine lizards, and within a few million years had diversified into forms of extraordinary size and variety. By the latest Cretaceous, mosasaurs were the dominant large marine predators of the world's oceans. Fast, powerful, apparently warm-blooded to some degree, with body plans ranging from sleek, tuna-like pursuit predators to more heavily built, shorter-tailed forms that may have been ambush hunters. The largest mosasaurs, Tylosaurus, Haenosaurus, Mosasaurus itself, reached lengths of 12 to 17 meters or more, making them among the largest predators of any environment in the history of life. Their distribution was global. Mosasaur fossils have been found on every continent, including Antarctica, testifying to a marine dominance that matched the terrestrial dominance of the dinosaurs in both scale and thoroughness. And like the dinosaurs, they were gone at the KPG boundary. Every mosasaur lineage, every species, every individual, extinct within the same narrow geological interval as the non-avian dinosaurs. The Mesozoic marine ecosystem, this extraordinary world of reptilian dominance in the world's oceans, ended as abruptly and completely as the terrestrial dinosaurian ecosystem. What filled the void? The same pattern as on land: small-bodied, metabolically flexible survivors, modern sharks, modern bony fish, and, gradually, the cetaceans, the ancestors of modern whales and dolphins, who entered the ocean from the land in the Eocene about 50 million years ago, and over the following tens of millions of years evolved to fill the niches that mosasaurs and plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs had vacated. The convergence between cetaceans and ichthyosaurs is, in this context, not merely interesting for the similarity of body plan it produced. It is also a demonstration of how thoroughly the same ecological niche can be reinvented by completely different lineages. Separated by tens of millions of years of evolutionary time, the ocean demanded a dolphin. First, 180 million years ago it got an ichthyosaur. 66 million years ago the slate was wiped clean, and then, starting 50 million years ago, it got a dolphin. The physics of the ocean are patient. The ecology is patient. Life is endlessly patient. Whatever niche exists, sooner or later, something will evolve to fill it. We have talked at length about what dinosaurs looked like. We have talked about their colour, their size, their anatomical adaptations. But there is another dimension of their existence that the fossil record addresses only partially and indirectly: the sensory world they inhabited, the sounds they made and heard, the smells they tracked and produced, the textures they felt, the ways in which they perceived and responded to the world around them. This is one of the least discussed but most fascinating aspects of dinosaur biology, and it is an area where recent research, particularly in the neuroscience of living archosaurs and the biomechanics of fossilized ear structures, is producing results that genuinely change how we picture the Mesozoic world. And the dinosaur era, with its 180 million years of imperfectly preserved but endlessly rich record, will keep providing material for this asymptotic approach for as long as there are people willing to walk out into the field and look. What a thing it is to live in a world where that work is being done, where, on any given day, someone somewhere is opening rock that has not seen light since the Jurassic, and finding in it the impression of a creature that no living eye has ever seen, and beginning the long, careful, reverential process of understanding it, of adding one more piece to the great, incomplete, magnificent puzzle of the ancient world. The work goes on tonight, as you sleep, in laboratories and field camps and museum storerooms and university offices around the world. The patient, meticulous, endlessly fascinating work of reconstructing the past continues. The dinosaur era is being recovered, slowly and imperfectly and with great care from the stones in which it was preserved, and each recovery, each new species described, each new behaviour inferred, each new fossil site mapped and excavated, is a small act of resurrection. A piece of the ancient world brought back into the light. Rest now knowing that work is happening, that the mysteries are not neglected, that somewhere someone is reading the rock and finding what was hidden, and that the story of the dinosaur era, enormous, ancient, full of wonders, is still, in the best sense of the word, alive. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.